Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Bell. I'm director of the Tau Centre here at Columbia. We're thrilled to welcome so many of you into this beautiful space, which is the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, which is run by my co-conspirator, Mark Hansen, who you'll be meeting later. So thank him and the Brown crew for hosting us here. Welcome to our afternoon discussing blockchain. My joke for the afternoon is if you'd all bought civil tokens, we wouldn't have to come out and discuss this. Yes, Vivian's laughing. That's fine. Yes, but we're really delighted you're here because one of the things that we do at Columbia Journalism School is work in the intersection between technology and journalism. And we've never had, as it were, so much interest in, I would say, one subject, which is blockchain, both from students, from faculty, from the people who are participating here, saying, what is it? Please explain it to me. How is this going to work, etc. So thanks very much indeed for your attention and your attendance. Just a couple of housekeeping points. For those of you who don't know, the restrooms are in the basement, or as we call them here, the first floor. It's not really the first floor, it's in the basement. And they're out that door and to the right. We will be having a break after the second panel at 3:20. If you need to get up and go at some point before then, just do it as quietly as you possibly can. Kind of the acoustics in here are terrific, but you can hear absolutely everything on stage, etc. And as we have a live stream, it would be good to keep the kind of noise at the back down to a minimum. So, without more ado, I want to introduce not really our first panel, they will be coming up in a minute, but when we were planning this, we said what we felt people would appreciate is somebody who really knows what blockchain is and what its applications might be, could come and give us an overview and an explanation. And immediately, Mark Hansen said, we need Natalia Stanetsky. And she said yes, rather foolishly. So Natalia is the founder of and organizer of Women in Blockchain. And she's now with Google. So she'll also be your moderator for the first panel, but I want to hand over to her so that she can give you a guide to blockchain. Natalia, thank you. Let's get my out the way.
I'll take my notes. Perfect.
Okay.
My mic is on. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very happy to share my excitement for the blockchain technology. Oh, there we go. Yes. As was mentioned, I'm a program manager at Google. So for the record, I'm not representing Google today or Google's opinion on blockchain. Today, I'm representing Women in Blockchain Group. We are a team of 6 organizers, and we lead the New York chapter. So the New York chapter was actually started in 2016 by my colleague. And at that point, there was just 30 members, and now we're at over 2,400. We're also building a global community of women in blockchain groups to bring diversity and inclusion and to increase awareness about blockchain technology and just technology of innovative technologies in general. Women have been historically sidelined in the definition of systems and products. So it's imperative and it's important to participate, to be recognized as leaders, and to drive the definition of the digital future using the innovative technologies for a more equitable society. So blockchain is a transformational technology. It has been the buzzword for the past year, potentially even longer than that, but particularly for the past year. How many of you are familiar with blockchain? How many of you know what blockchain is? How many of you can explain what blockchain is to others? Okay. All right, so before I dive into the actual explanation of what blockchain is, why don't we recall how we transact today? And I'll exclude cash transactions. So in order for a person to send money from person A to person B, we normally go through intermediaries. We go through middlemen that always capture value, that capture our data, and may or may not be secure. So why do we care about blockchain? In 2008, so-called Satoshi Nakamoto, right after the financial crisis, published a white paper, Peer-to-Peer Electronic Cash System. This is when the Bitcoin and blockchain was born. So what is blockchain? Sorry, that was my introductory slide. So this is actually a good definition of blockchain. Blockchain is an open distributed ledger that records transactions between two parties, confirmed and verified by a consensus mechanism in an efficient and permanent way. So why don't we decipher each part of this definition? What do we mean by open and distributed? Open, that means that anyone can participate, and distributed, that everyone always has a copy of the same blockchain. Ledger is essentially a record of transactions. It could be money transactions, it could be exchange of value, assets, or anything, you name it. And it's always between two parties, peer-to-peer, individual to individual, blockchain address to blockchain address. Verified by a consensus mechanism, that means there is no single third-party verification. It's distributed by, it's verified by a consensus mechanism. There's a group of verifiers that verify that the transaction had happened. Records are immutable, and once recorded, cannot be changed maliciously or on purpose. So why is it called blockchain? Blockchain essentially is a list of records called blocks. They are linked and secured using cryptography. Each block typically contains a hash pointer to the previous block. It always contains a timestamp, and it contains the transaction data. So why don't we use a more of a simpler example to explain what blockchain is? Let's say we're all participants of in a blockchain. We all have a copy of this blockchain. We all have unique addresses on this blockchain. Let's say some of us are verifiers and some of us are just active participants. Let's say Mike and Nancy are unique addresses. Mike wants to give an apple to Nancy. We as verifiers confirm that Mike and Nancy are unique addresses. We verified that this transaction happened, that Mike gave Nancy an apple. We timestamp this transaction because we do want to record when this transaction happened. We as verifiers encrypt and secure this transaction and put it in the first block. So once the first block is created, we send the copy of this blockchain to everybody. So everybody has the same copy of the blockchain. Everyone knows that Mike gave Nancy that apple. In order to create the second block, let's say Nancy decides to give that apple to somebody else. We as verifiers again confirm that Nancy has this apple. It's no longer in Mike's hands. We verify that the other person's address is unique, and we record this transaction that Nancy sent an apple or gave an apple to somebody else. We timestamp this transaction. In our second block, we reference the previous block, and we put all the information about this transaction. So this is why blockchain is a blockchain. It's a chain of transaction. It's a linear record of transactions. There are different types of blockchains. We have public blockchains and we have private blockchains. The difference essentially is pretty easy. Participants in a public blockchain is open to everybody, and private blockchain is open to a set of participants. As many of you have heard of Bitcoin and Ethereum, these are the most popular examples of public blockchain. Bitcoin blockchain is the one that was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, and it's a pure peer-to-peer transaction type of blockchain. Ethereum blockchain was created by Vitalik Buterin and Joseph Lubin, and that one specifically is a little bit more interesting. It supports complex artifacts such as smart contracts. Smart contracts are, as recently was described by Vitalik Buterin, are persistent scripts. They're stored procedures. Essentially, it's bits of code that execute a transaction once a certain criteria is met. As you can see that little code on the screen, I'll give you another example, a more simpler example to explain what smart contract is. Let's say I set a stipulation that if and when my child turns 18, I want to send a certain amount of money from my account to my child's account when he or she turns 18. So if and when that happens, my child gets the money, the contract automatically executes this transaction and sends the money from my account to my child's account. That was a simple explanation. Smart contracts are probably a little bit more complex in the real world, but this is essentially what blockchain is in a nutshell. What are the benefits of blockchain? Oops. Can we fix that? I'm not sure what's happening. So blockchains, you'll see the actual benefits of blockchains. So blockchains are distributed, it's a distributed architecture. So there's no central point of failure. Everybody always has a copy. So if somebody's computer gets disrupted, somebody else has the copy of the same contract. Blockchains are a record of transactions. They are a listing of transactions in a linear sequence, and there is always that traceability and trust aspect. What some people like to describe blockchain is, it's a peer-to-peer trustless system. By trustless, what we mean is that trust is distributed among the participants, and it's trust with everyone in aggregate. And I believe the last... the last one is secure. Consensus mechanism provides that fraud prevention, because essentially you would need more than 50% of you would need to convince more than 50% of the people to change the record of the transactions. So with this, the last point is that if anybody has any questions for me, or in general for Women of Blockchain, feel free to reach out to me at this email. Feel free to follow us on Twitter. And if anybody wants to join our LinkedIn group, it's called Women in Blockchain Global. With this, I would like to transition into our first panel, blockchain. Do we need it, and what do we do with this? And I'd like to invite Vivian from Civil, Nelly from New York Times, and Aaron from Columbia. I hope I pronounced everybody's names right. So why don't we do a round of introductions? If you can introduce yourself, tell us where you work, what do you do, and how you got into blockchain.
Yeah, my name is Nellie Bowles. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I cover technology and culture, and I got into blockchain because I cover kind of like cultural trends in the city, and I noticed a bunch of kids were making a ton of money in this thing called like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and so I started following them around.
I'm Vivian Schiller. I run something called the Civil Foundation. My whole career has been in journalism. I've been a journalist and a news executive at a whole bunch of different news organizations over my career, including the New York Times. My relationship with blockchain began exactly 3.5 months ago. So, and I'm interested in it because blockchain is here, it is with us, it's only going to get bigger. There's going to be an intersection with journalism, and I want to make sure that we harness it for the interests of journalism, and that we set ourselves up to protect and support journalism, and not the other way around.
I'm Eran Tromer. I'm a professor of computer science at Tel Aviv University and a research associate here at Computer Science. And my research area is cryptography and information security. Put otherwise, how can we take broken systems and make them trustworthy by using mathematics and algorithms? And we've been studying this for many years, looking at all the ways that algorithms can be proven secure and how the computers that use the algorithms can be made resilient. We've been breaking codes by pointing microphones and antennas at computers and extracting their secret keys and then working to fix that. And looking at all of these scenarios where there's someone out there that might plausibly be untrusted. You can leave that, thank you. And the emergence of blockchain for us was an amazing opportunity, because suddenly it's not just that someone somewhere might be compromised, it's everybody is compromised. Anyone who's trying to communicate over the blockchain might, for all we know, be trying to steal the money of anyone else. And that for us creates amazing opportunities for creating new algorithms and modeling the security reactions and conditions under which people operate, and to protect their integrity and privacy in ways that we'll probably discuss later.
Perfect, thank you. Why don't we do like a little introduction or cover the basics? Vivian, do you, if everybody can hear me, maybe I can bring it up. Anyway, can we cover what do you consider journalism, and where does it start and where does it end?
Yeah.
What's journalism?
What is journalism?
Where are we?
Well, a reporter meets a newspaper. No, sorry. I was prepared for this question, and I still don't have a great answer for it. One of my favorite definitions of, journalism is the stuff that people need to know in order to be fully, and this is not, don't tweet this is not like a stuff, it's not great, so I'm just speaking informally. It's what the public needs to know in order to be informed and active members of their community and to live their lives fully. Again, that is not, I'm sure if I were writing this in a book, I would come up with much flowery language. There's many definitions out there, but for the purposes of this conversation and for the purposes of what we're talking about, at least what we're doing at Civil, it's making sure that people in communities that, as everybody in this room no doubt knows, who are not necessarily getting the information they need about what are happening in their communities, what's happening in certain parts of the world, what's happening in certain industries. We are there to make sure that information, that we can support journalism and journalists to make sure that the public has the information that they need. That is our reason for being. Blockchain is simply a way to get us there.
Nelly or
Good
Aaron,
definition.
would you like to add anything else to this question?
Oh, no. That works for you. Okay, good.
All right, if you don't mind covering, how has the state of journalism has changed over the past 5 to 10 years?
I'll take that one. There are, we could spend, and in fact, there have been many symposia hosted in this very room over the years about all of the dramatic changes and the impact of what's happening in journalism and meeting the information needs of the public. I would, in short, since this is not that seminar, I would, in short, categorize what we're facing in the world into two buckets. Each of these represents a crisis. Together, they're pretty cataclysmic. The first bucket is trust, and the trust crisis, and the declining trust that the public has in journalism and in news organizations, and or the information they're getting, which is not necessarily from news organizations, more and more, as I'm sure everybody knows, it's from Facebook or WhatsApp or WeChat or what have you. So the trust crisis is real, and it is profound, and it is critical. That alone would be bad. The second bucket of crises has to do with, and it's not unrelated, has to do with financial sustainability of news organizations. If news organizations cannot, if journalists cannot pay their rent and put food on the table, they can't be in journalism, which means that they can't do the vital reporting that the public needs. Business models, again, this is a seminar for another day, but business models have pretty much collapsed for a whole bunch of reasons we could spend a lot of time talking about. But this is a big problem, and there's no obvious solution. There's no single silver bullet that's going to solve the problems of journalism. But what's changed in the last 10 years is the declining trust, the collapsing business models. Together, we have tremendous amount of news deserts, misinformation, all of the things that we're dealing with today.
I would add that I feel like the actual work of journalism, like what I actually do day to day, hasn't changed that much in the last 10, 20, 100 years. Like, I still just wander around with a notebook. And maybe we tweet now or Instagram or something, but there's still, the foundation is the same as it's been.
I don't think journalism, the act of journalism needs to be reinvented. It's the way that it is communicated and distributed and engaged, and
Okay, perfect. So I think that kind of covered I would say, the risks in the journalism industry. Why don't we dive into the actual opportunities? What are the opportunities in the journalism industry? What do we face today?
This is where I told you that I'd have my rant, which is I think that there's tremendous opportunity in business journalism, and specifically in business journalism outside of New York. I have been a reporter in San Francisco for, I guess, 8 years now, and there just aren't a lot of writers out there. There's a ton of low-hanging fruit. I think one thing that we've seen in the last 10 years is the increasing consolidation of the media industry in New York and in sort of certain pockets within New York even. And I have found personally, and I think as I see some of my friends become editors and bosses and try to start recruiting, I see how few people there are. So I think if you're willing to live outside of New York City and report on these industries, there's huge opportunity. And there's huge demand for readership. Like, I just do like a basic story about blockchain kids, and like, the numbers are, there's just a lot of demand for on-the-ground reporting in these communities.
Do you mean specific, sorry, you're asking a question about in Silicon Valley and tech companies. It's a great
in Silicon Valley and tech companies. It's
underreported story of the universe, as Emily has been preaching for quite a long time.
It's the biggest story. Other than Trump, like, it is the by far biggest story of the last decade, and it is so undercovered. It's amazing. Like, it's astonishing. We have a journalist meetup. Like, the whole media world of San Francisco gets together, and we fit in the back of a single bar. Wow. And we do that about once a month, and we all kind of hang out. I feel like I'm one of those people who's like, come west. Come west. Let me tell you, there's just gold flying everywhere. If you have a pen, you'll get a job. Like, but it's true.
I think that in the context of blockchain, there are some interesting challenges and opportunities for journalism. On the challenges side, there is the matter of conveying this often non-trivial technology in the face of very significant disinformation from some of the purveyors of the technology. And this is especially problematic because a lot of this technology is very effectively monetized in the form of tokens that are traded on exchanges, and there's the question of how much are they worth. Now, the question of how reporting affects valuation of assets, of course, arises elsewhere. But with, say, traditional stock, there are always fundamentals to fall back to. And even if there is some hype or misinformation, eventually there are earnings and growth and assets that keep things in check, ideally. With blockchain assets, we don't really know how to value them. Fundamentals are an open problem to understand. And a lot of the valuation of these tokens, some of which are worth billions of dollars in terms of market capitalization.
It gets crazy. I mean, how much, like the Ripple valuation, what did it get to?
Well, that got to the many billions, and the ones who determine that is, for most of the public, are essentially the reporters who need to somehow distill this very aggressive marketing and convey it in a way that will guide the lay investors. It's all on you. Yep.
It's because it's so undercover.
So that's a challenge. But there's also a great opportunity. Because in this age where the notion of facts and alternative facts is apparently under negotiation, and when we are destabilizing basic norms of evaluating what's reality and judging it, and also when emerging technologies like so-called deep fakes, very sophisticated fake videos and audios and pictures, threaten our ability to intuitively grasp what's true and what's not, even given a recording. Blockchains give us an opportunity, because once we really do have a reliable blockchain that can timestamp events in an irrevocable way, and if that blockchain is widely available and can be investigated, then we can establish what is truth, at least for the parts of truth that are recorded there, and maybe proper investigative journalism can use that as a new resource.
Well, and in terms of covering it, like when you read about something like the Ripple valuation or one of these tokens and the insane billion-dollar valuations, it's really confusing and kind of hard to get your mind around. But when you actually go and spend some time with the person who created it, all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more clear, like when you're on the ground with them. And kind of the scamminess of certain ones becomes a lot more clear and a lot easier to see up close. And it's really easy for the industry to obfuscate from far away.
You know, this was something that we really struggled with and have been facing at Civil, because we are a blockchain-based company who is issuing and will use an Ethereum-based cryptocurrency called the Civil to operate the network. And in trying to communicate to the public about buying these tokens and using these tokens, there are many obstacles to communicating that to the public. A lot of them, including the fact that we are the first consumer-based blockchain company offering that I think ever, best that I can tell, at least in this country. But part of the challenge is there is that reputation. When people hear about cryptocurrency, they think scams, they think currency speculation, they think, get-rich-quick schemes. We're the opposite of that. There's also was a lot of challenges about purchasing cryptocurrencies, which if anybody in this room it's very, very difficult. But that reputation that cryptocurrency has is really a problem to overcome. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm not here to save or try to hold up the value of the blockchain industry, but I am interested in what we're doing at Civil around journalism, and to that extent, I think once we launch and people get into it and use these tokens, they will hopefully understand the value and how that works in a way that feels very germane to their lives, instead of this kind of abstract, Bitcoin buying and selling.
Yeah. So can we actually dive a little bit more into why blockchain? Why do we need it now? Is it really a scalable solution?
Yeah,
do we need it?
My question is what's the difference between why, with Civil, why do blockchain rather than just money, like just American fiat currency?
Right.
Why do a token?
Right. Yes, I get that question a lot, because in fact, what we're building, and what Civil is, what we're trying to create is a global network of trustworthy news organizations. That's it. I mean, we are trying to build, to help get at, some of these trust issues that we talked about, and so that people understand when they go to a news organization that they can reasonably, not to verify every fact, but reasonably expect that what they're getting there is quality journalism done by journalists, ethical journalists. So why do we need blockchain, and why do we need cryptocurrency to do that? I'll talk about in terms of blockchain, and we kind of have to separate these two things, and you will quickly learn and see that I am not a technologist, so I can't really even explain blockchain besides it's a distributed ledger. But I can tell you what's important to civil about blockchain and cryptocurrency. From a blockchain perspective, being able to preserve content because there are multiple instances in the past, and there will be multiple more, particularly outside this country, where content can be taken down. And we're seeing, as journalism is under threat more and more in the world, and certain regimes are emboldened to crack down on journalism. We're seeing that all over the world. There's a greater risk to preserving and making sure that what journalists are reporting can be preserved even if their servers are taken down or destroyed. So on one level, that's where blockchain is very helpful. But where I think it gets really interesting is in the crypto economics. So the civil token, when you have a token, it's two things. First of all, as you know, token is just a piece of software, obviously, but it serves two purposes. One is it is literally a piece of currency that you can use via the smart contracts that we were talking about. That a member of the public can exchange a civil token in a frictionless way with no middleman, no transaction costs, in a way that they can reward newsrooms, they can pay newsrooms, they can, something that people have talked about forever and has just not been possible in a fiat currency world is, micro-tipping and micro-payments, and sort of enabling a way for that relationship, to deepen the direct relationship between the public and news organizations. But the token is also a governance mechanism. So a token is a vote. And on the civil token, so I talk about it's a network of trustworthy news organizations. Well, how do you keep it trustworthy and make sure that it's not infested with the info wars of the world? And that is where these tokens come in. They are a way for people to challenge and vote to make sure that good news organizations are on and bad news organizations stay off. That's at a minimum what we'll have for launch. And then as the platform develops, ways to sort of reward and up-rank news organizations that follow, that are doing great work. So again, that token is both a voting mechanism and a currency of our smart contracts that without any intermediary, and those are advantages that it has over fiat currency. And also, it's a platform to create this network. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations. People said, well, yes, but you could do all that with fiat currency. But guess what? Nobody has. And in order to do that, you would have to build a platform to be able to create it. And this is, if nothing else, this is a platform to build it. So, there you go.
I don't know, maybe we want to switch gears. I don't know, Erin, if you want to cover a little bit more from a Columbia's standpoint of view. Speak more about it, but a little bit more about the projects.
Certainly, but I cannot resist making one more comment on the issue of low friction payments and monetization. This is not just about costs, it's also about control and privacy. One of the big problems in the attempt so far to make these micropayments work is that there is always someone centralized who's trusted with managing them and has full visibility. And that someone may be Facebook or maybe Equifax or any of the other companies that we seem to be completely trusting with our personal financial information without much choice, and despite their utter failure to protect that information, and in fact their business models that are based on violating it. And cryptocurrencies give us an opportunity to fight back and to be able to, for example, read a newspaper without revealing who we are and what we read, which is currently very difficult. And this is one of the challenges that we and our colleagues at Columbia are pursuing. For example, the matter of enabling privacy-preserving transactions and exchanges, privacy-preserving smart contracts, is a topic of very active research in the School of Computer Science. It builds on cryptographic mechanisms that we've been developing for many years for other applications where integrity is paramount, and here we have the ultimate one, where everybody needs to be convinced that the transaction is legit. In fact, this has recently been formalized as a very large university-wide effort, the Columbia IBM Center for Blockchain and Data Transparency Research.
No wonder you had to read that.
Yeah. And it's a mouthful because it does encompass a lot. It builds on the interdisciplinary strength of Columbia University. It includes all the pertinent schools, including engineering, computer science, data science, as well as business school, the law school, and international and public affairs, all of which will be building together new applications, identifying needs and constructing the systems that answer them, as well as pioneering ways to balance the needs of regulation, of law enforcement, and public policy in this technical context. There are already courses taught at Columbia University and several more that we are constructing as part of this new center. It's not just about education and research. The third leg of this newly established center is enabling innovation and tech transfer by creating accelerators for the startups that will take these academic innovations to practice. It's also very exciting to see grassroots operations here at Columbia University. There's the blockchain at Columbia and also the Columbia University Blockchain Alliance, completely different, of course. Shades of Monty Python here. And
are people like mining? Are people mining here?
I wonder whether they're mining. I assume some are. They are teaching each other about these opportunities and technology. For me, it's really exciting to see things that we used to see in academia as a very technical, advanced topic in some graduate level cryptography course taught at computer science, suddenly be the bread and butter that's being discussed in the hallways and thrown around by MBAs, because these are the right tools, and Columbia is apparently the right place to exercise these tools.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm not sure, do we have time for any more questions, or are you going to... Nelly, has New York Times considered getting involved in blockchain, or?
If they were, they wouldn't tell me any of their business strategy. Yeah. I would, first of all, because I would tell everyone, and second of all, because I'd have terrible advice on what to. I'm not sure if they're interested in getting involved in blockchain. We're not allowed to invest in blockchain, obviously. Nathaniel Popper, who covers it for the Times on a sort of daily basis, breaking news on it. Is always asked this question of like, are you a blockchain millionaire now too? No, we are not blockchain millionaires. But I think we're going to keep covering it a lot. I mean, covering it's been tricky because it was so exciting when the bubble of it was so hot, and it's hard not to like start to believe it, and it's hard to figure out where your belief should end and where your skepticism should start. And I think I kind of thought that like maybe this would just be my beat now. Maybe I was just going to be like covering blockchain. And then the last few months have been hard to figure out where it's going and what's happening and why the price it fluctuates so intensely and whether it is all scammers. And
can I ask you a question though? I mean, when you said when it was so hot, the prices were hot, but they were, I mean, how much of that, I mean, how tied was that to the actual value of blockchain versus people speculating on these
then how tied is it
magic
ever?
coins?
It's all, it was all speculation. Yeah. And it's, then how do I know now it's not? Like that's what it feels like standing on like sand. You're like,
Aaron, do you have any insight to that? Well, what do you consider more valuable?
Right now, is the bubble done?
Yeah.
Right now, like, is this now when the real work begins?
And
back then, no, yeah, like the scammers for your work, the scammers are a nightmare because it makes it so when you're trying to do something serious like civil, it's really hard to figure out what's real. Right now, are we in the moment when like the bubble's done and now it's like, okay, now the real work begins?
I think there's a complete disconnect between the markets and the actual technology and engineering.
Yeah, I believe that.
The hype does its thing. There are the natural cycles. There are many elements here affecting the market behavior that have nothing to do with the actual progress of the projects, with the actual scientific innovation. And if you put the markets aside and look at what's being built nowadays, then things become really exciting.
Okay, so
Because
you
we're
think
seeing a lot
now
of
it's-
fundamental tools emerging, for example, approaches to succinct zero-knowledge proofs of knowledge that enable you to just throw away most of the chain for most purposes and reason just about the parts that you care about, would otherwise achieve scalability, which is one of the great challenges. Now we have plausible approaches for solving it. We used to have the matters of privacy. As we saw in the introduction, you post all transactions on the blockchain for anyone to see. So how can you achieve your privacy? How can you prevent your competitors and colleagues from seeing every transaction that you do in a street corner using Bitcoin? And now we have ways to achieve that as well. I happen to have co-founded one of these, the Zcash cryptocurrency. There are several others, and they are becoming practical and achieve better scalability as well, despite the fluctuations in market prices. And likewise, in the enterprise realm, you see ways to integrate blockchain technology in its various uses into important business applications in banking, in asset tracking, in aerospace. And we've been fortunate to have found this monetization model that allows all of this repressed technology and whiteboard science to actually transfer to the next stage of having engineers spend their time on doing it properly. And even at the current valuation, it's enabling that, and we will see this come to fruition in the upcoming years.
In terms of education about blockchain and cryptocurrency, what would you suggest to the audience what to concentrate on and where to get that knowledge from? Like, what's the difference between cryptocurrency and blockchain and what to concentrate on?
Nellie's. Yeah.
No, read Nathaniel Poppy. He's like the best. Read mine if you want to read what people are doing with the money.
It's an issue. I mean, education around blockchain and cryptocurrency is definitely an issue. It's a little abstract for people to understand. I mean, that's why I think the more, as we and others go into create blockchain cryptocurrency-based businesses that are for consumers and are not sort of around banking or supply chain or other B2B, I think it will become more accessible. So people need to see it, touch it, feel it, in the same way as, in the 80s or early 90s, like internet was, a very confusing thing. I think it just, that people need to see how it touches their lives personally.
Aaron.
So this is indeed a challenge, and I could mention specific books, like one out of Princeton on more technical vibe, Chris Bernitzky's Crypto Assets book on less technical vibe. They are becoming rapidly outdated, and I think part of it is trying to grasp blockchain. I mean, this is like going to Home Depot and trying to grasp hardware. There's just too much of it, and you need to think primarily about the applications that you need focus on, the problems that you have that need solving, and try to see what particular areas within this large landscape are relevant and what particular projects answer your needs.
Sorry, one more thing I wanted to mention is a great way to if you are not a tech expert and you want to understand blockchain, is to listen to the Zigzag podcast. So Manu Samarati, who's on the next panel, is sitting here. She and her producing partners have created an amazing podcast called Zigzag, which tracks their journey with civil, but also sort of explains blockchain in a way where they are learning it and sharing that experience of learning it as they go along. So highly recommend.
And then I'm just realizing most of the people I've profiled in the space learned by going to meetups and got into it by going to meetups. So didn't learn by reading, didn't learn by following the news cycle on it, which, as we've talked about, is mostly it's by going and talking to other people who are in the space and who are deep, building it and stuff. So there's tons of blockchain meetups in New York and anywhere. So if you go to a few of those, then you start to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's
That's how they, no, that's how they describe it. They say you go to a meetup and then you go down the rabbit hole, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's essentially what happened to me with Women of Blockchain Meetup. So, all right, why don't we transition into audience Q&A, and I start the first hand.
Over 20 years ago here at Columbia, we tried to create a verification system so that an image that was edited would know that, would have a tell, it'd be edited. The technology was not adequate for us to do that at the time. You mentioned verification. Right now, we're on the edge of computer-generated video, audio, and still images that are indistinguishable from the original. I could easily see blockchain with the chain starting with a code on the sensor, for instance, of a camera, and then moving forward, but I could still see a lot of ways to disrupt it. You mentioned verification, and are you working on it? Are you thinking this way?
Definitely, and the matter of authenticity and provenance of media is of crucial importance to many areas, ours being one of them. And there are several components here that modern cryptography enables. One is the timestamping, the irrevocable commitment to the source raw material that you can post on the blockchain without revealing that material, but still being able to connect to it. A complementary technology that's required is being able to edit that media and to convert, say, raw footage into the final result that will be broadcast, while maintaining some notion of provenance and connecting it to whatever was originally recorded. And that is actually the topic of a paper that we published a couple of years ago, showing a prototype for how this can be done for still pictures, and extending this to full-fledged high bandwidth video is one of those open research problems that I hope that can make the transfer to commercialization.
And the second row.
I have a question for Vivian. You said one of the challenges in
Could you
journalism
bring it closer?
testing. You mentioned that one of the challenges today in journalism was that content could be taken down, and that the blockchain can help by preserving content. So is it that the content itself will actually be stored in the transaction, or are we storing some hash of it such that the large content is kept outside of it and you can represent it and verify it? It's kind of a techie question.
Yeah,
but
I know. I'm not going to be able to answer it from a. Can I borrow yours?
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not going to be able to answer it from a technology point of view. Perhaps my colleague on the panel here can. It really both is possible. Most of the news organizations will be storing the hash because it's less gas. So that is, which means it's just cheaper, but less computing power. But either is possible. And if you ask me a follow-up question to get into any level of detail beyond that, I'm going to be unfortunately incapable of doing it. But I don't know if you need more. Yeah.
Sorry.
I want to follow up on another crisis that we mentioned is about the economic. Okay, journalist needs a livelihood to pay the bill. Is there any successful cases that blockchain has been already used to deliver economic livelihood or prosperity to journalists? And how does the blockchain solution compare or relate to other existing 20th century solutions, such as using taxpayers' money, public knowledge, or public,
that's a whole other category.
or about, I just came from Montreal last week. There, I'm hearing there is still a very strong unionization among the newsroom. So how does blockchain, the technological solution, form a relationship with other?
So let me answer the second question first. The business models and sources of revenue for journalism could be the subject of a week-long, month-long seminar here at Columbia. The one thing I will say, at least about, and I can't, what we're doing is that any revenue or both cost savings or incremental revenue that can be derived from what we're doing is in addition to whatever news organizations will continue to do. So we're not saying only operate through civil and don't take people's credit cards for membership, don't do Kickstarters. They work in tandem. This is, this is just another revenue stream. Maybe over time it will be so meaningful that, news organizations can move away from, say, certain kinds of advertising. But for the moment, the last thing that we want to do is try to cut off anybody's existing revenue streams. We just want to add to it. The first question was, just say the first two words and I'll remember. Sorry, I just...
Actual successes.
Oh, yeah, well, we haven't launched yet. We will be launching before the end of the year. So we have what we're calling the first fleet. In fact, there's at least 4 newsrooms from our first fleet of news organizations represented in this room. Well, I thought you were gone for a second. At least 4, there may be more. We have, in full candor, we've given them grants, fiat currency grants, but we will, when they're with us as part of our launch, and when they launch, we'll be working closely with them to hope that, to figure out ways that they can derive additional revenue. We're going to experiment around tipping, there's a whole bunch of other economic opportunities that unlock that will be, but we haven't launched yet, so I'm not aware if there's a successful other ways that news organizations are making money.
Okay.
To dominate that.
Last question, that lady.
Hi. I have to ask about the token sale, and Vivian, you referred to the obstacles around communicating to the public. What do you do differently next time?
We're going to, if anybody has read, and I highly recommend if you didn't, it's painful to read. John Keefe with Quartz wrote a blog post about the 44 steps it took him to get from zero to buying civil tokens. That's about 43 steps too many. So we're working to greatly simplify it. It's not worth going into all of the reasons that it was too difficult, but it was too difficult. So we're working to make it simpler. That's obstacle number 1. And and then the other thing, just in general, about we're also working to communicate. We have been from the beginning, very clearly, so people understand why they should be part of civil, and that it's not about the tokens. The tokens are a means to an end. It's about the journalism. It's about the incredible work that these news organizations, these first set of news organizations that I mentioned that are represented in this room, who are doing such incredible reporting already, and the hundreds more and hopefully thousands more that will be joining when we go live. That's what this is about.
And then last question, right?
So it brought to my mind that we have a current challenge of verification going on in the voter ID system. So current forms of verification, such as identification cards and street addresses, are actually being used against citizens. So my question is, how does blockchain verification anticipate the very foundation at which you're trying to build can be used to compromise citizen rights, perhaps? That's more dystopian.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. There are various outcomes, various ways this can play out. One is where increasing reliance on a blockchain that is visible to all or to misguided regimes may result in these kind of pathological outcomes. And we are seeing extreme visibility leading to oppression in some countries worldwide. The other end of the spectrum is using blockchains as a way to give people ownership over their own data. We have the means, with the technical means, to have the blockchain consist of a sequence of encrypted records attesting to people's citizenship, financial history, biometrics, anything that can be connected to the real world and attested by someone. And have people prove that they are indeed eligible to vote or are eligible for a credit score or whatever other property logically follows from the content of the blockchain without revealing those records, while fully preserving their privacy and protecting their financial and personal history in all regards that do not pertain to the thing that matters, like their eligibility for voting. And there are actually several efforts, several companies that are trying to build and commercialize these frameworks, these technologies. There's a lot of research that's happening in my lab and others on building the requisite tools to make this efficient. But at the end of the day, it's a decision that will be made by society, whether explicitly or implicitly in an emergent way, or just imposed by the very regimes, on where along this spectrum we end up.
By the way, if I could just add one thing to that, not about the voting, but what you're talking about, the ability for someone to have a verifiable identity but not actually have that identity connected to be known who they are, is very important to what we're doing in terms of being able to support journalism. Journalists who are working in parts of the world where their identity, we need to know who they are, they need to be verified, so to speak, but their identity cannot be revealed. So that's very important.
Great. I think we're done with the first panel. Erin, Vivian, Nelly, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think no problem.
Sorry about the.
Hey, Jared Manouche, so nice to meet you finally. How are you?
Did she tell you?
No.
We were on a panel.
Oh, was that the
Wednesday.
one? Were you on that one as well? Oh.
I saw fish. I saw fish Tuesday night in Albany. Took an Amtrak at 5
Oh my
a.m.
God.
Right onto the. But apparently one of
That is dedication.
we were videoed.
She she's great. Yeah, she's awesome.
Okay, let's add some music to get you in the right
We
mood.
didn't do any introductions.
Oh, I like that guitar. All right, this is good. Okay. Okay, here we go. Number one.
We've got a surprise, don't we? Surprise. Nobody heard it, right? No, I did, but I didn't. I mean, I just heard it. I didn't. It wasn't a. This is a horrible thing. Hello. How are we? There's a couple of seats in the front. If there's someone standing in the back who's, Oh, we're gonna give it a minute. So does anyone want to fill up a minute? Yeah, there's water right by your feet. There's one. No, there's here.
Use water.
I could do it.
Oh yeah, he's cool too. Yeah, I was thinking.
Will you
I should
tell
turn
me
my
when
mic
to
off
go?
while we're banned.
We can go now. Great. All right. So I'll start introducing myself so that the people who come in late haven't lost anything, because I am a minor player in this affair. My name is Mark Hansen. I am the director of the Brown Institute here. Welcome to the house that Helen Gurley Brown built. We're very excited to help co-host events like this. Oh, the bearer of water. Look at you. Would you like a third?
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. And maybe one more? Look at that. Well, now you have to drink it. Now you're taking it. All right. So we are the panel is the blockchain in journalism, and I'm going to try to make this as concrete as we possibly can, because we have people with concrete experience, people who've built seminal structures in the blockchain. And what we're going to see, I think, from this series of speakers is the blockchain being used as a way of coordinating around the tasks of journalism. So in addition to recording transactions, we're going to see the blockchain used as a tool for arriving at consensus in a kind of distributed way. So it's going to be in support of all the functions that Vivian said were journalism. Thank you for that. I tweeted that out, and the world now knows what journalism is. And that means everything from reporting and assigning provenance to interviews or images to fact-checking to the business of journalism and who gets to serve ads and who's a good actor and who's not. So we're very pleased to have with us 3 panelists who have built aspects of this ecosystem and have made use of aspects of this ecosystem. We have Mike Golden, we have Jared Dicker, and we have Manoush Zamarati, like if I get enough of a running start, that's gonna be great. So what I thought we would do, or actually what I was told to do, is have you each give, they said 7 to 8 minutes, and I don't know anyone who thinks in 7 to 8 minutes, but you get 7 to 8 minutes and introduce yourselves, where you've come from, and your I know Jared's thinking I'm never fitting into 7 or 8 minutes, but we'll somehow keep him in the box. 7, 8 minutes, describe the organization you're with, what you've been working on, how you see blockchain intersecting, whether that's through cryptocurrency or these other sort of transactional methods, intersecting with journalism and the acts of journalism. So would you like to go first?
Yeah, I
Mitch?
want to start, and I think I need to start with a clarification. I have built nothing.
No, I said
Okay.
no. I said the or. I said or been
Okay.
a creative force in one of these systems.
That I can manage.
Yes,
I think I'm kind of picking up the baton here from Vivian in that my background is I'm a journalist. I've been with the BBC, with Reuters for a long time, and then most recently with WNYC, New York Public Radio. What happened was there was a moment where my executive producer and we made a show called Note to Self, and we were kind of ready to do our own thing, to move on, and we serendipitously met Josh Benson, who I saw hanging out in the back there, who said, I'm doing this weirdo project called Civil, and I think you guys might actually be great. He was recruiting people to newsrooms, people who wanted to become sort of mini publishers, part of this first fleet that Vivian was describing. And as we learned more about what Civil was and realized we really didn't understand what the hell they were talking about, but it was super intriguing, and they were giving us money and tokens, but we didn't care about the tokens because we didn't know what they were. We were like, oh, well, that's the story, because if this is going to be as big as they say it's going to be, somebody needs to document this, because this is kind of as Nellie was saying, like, this is the other story that's happening, and it really kind of blew our minds. So what I wanted to put up was my first slide, if you would. So we made a podcast. It's called Zigzag, and it is we call it a podcast about changing the course of capitalism, journalism, and women's lives. So not very big goals at all, really. And what we're doing is we're telling our story. 2 women who quit their stable jobs in journalism to go into the far less stable world of blockchain journalism, and are documenting it along the way in terms of us as mothers, which is a key component of our lives. We are not going to pretend that we are like working, like that's part of it, the balance thing. The other part is being able to pay the bills. We talk a lot about that as entrepreneurs, which is kind of new for both of us. And then, of course, for me, as a tech journalist, I wrote a book about the attention economy. My bag is explaining technology to people in very easy, digestible, even fun ways so that they care and feel empowered as consumers to respond to the technologists making this stuff so that it works in their favor. And so I wanted to play just a very brief clip, which
Blockchain is complicated. There is no denying it. But we can do better. Breaking down big ideas is what we do. So, you ready? Here are 3 things that you need to know about blockchain. We're going to build on them, but let's just start with these 3 things. And actually, let's add some music to get you in the right mood. Oh, I like that guitar. All right, this is good. Okay, here we go. Number 1, something you need to know about blockchain. Blockchain is related to something you probably have heard of, Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is blockchain's baby. Bitcoin is blockchain's baby.
There's a whole thing.
Cool,
It goes
okay,
on
good.
and on
So,
like that.
got number 1, ready for number 2.
Yeah, I got a lot of tweets being like, oh my God, fuck you. All I'm doing is walking around singing Bitcoin's blockchain's baby. But like, we got the point across, right? I think we are at this point, like we're talking on, I think, an extremely high level here But the majority of the public, either their eyes glaze over when they hear the words blockchain, I know mine did, or they think it's Bitcoin and they think it's scammers. And some of the things that I had learned about Ethereum and the ideas that Sybil had really like got me very excited as a tech journalist that this was something really was worth exploring. I haven't seen the proof yet, so I'm at the like suspension of disbelief part in the story, waiting to see it happen, but I'm not there yet, which is why I'm super psyched that you guys are here, because they're the people who are actually using it. So that's me.
Thank you. Go. Okay, yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Jared Dicker. I'm the CEO of Poet. That's not me up there, but I appreciate the background anyway. So I'll give a quick background as to how I ended up here, because I used to do what everyone in this audience likely does. I was in charge of innovation, which is a great fluffy title at the Washington Post for the past 3 years. Prior, I was at Time Inc. and also at the Huffington Post. And much of my career was always framed around how we could actually start to create the environment that we want to live in as creators. I loved that notion because apparently no one ever wanted to work on ad tech or on subscriptions or business growth. And me being a former journalist, I was like, wow, I could get paid double and have some sort of creative flexibility to try to solve these problems in interesting ways. And what I realized very early on is that no one knows anything. And if you could tell a good story and you could build within that story, then you could kind of craft the results that you want to be being able to work within. So when I was at the Huffington Post, that was native advertising. When I was at Time Inc., that was brief. And when I was at the Washington Post, we built a part of our company called Red and Arc, which I'm sure everyone is familiar here, where we actually built an entirely new software as a service arm that drives a ton of revenue for the Washington Post. So towards the end of my tenure at the Post, though, I really started trying to wrap my head around what's the real problem, right? We're really good at kind of like masking symptoms and figuring out, well, how can we make up for ad dollars or subscription dollars? And how can we survive from Facebook and Google, but not really kind of honing in on the bigger issues that are going to continue to cause us pain. And that, to me, what I was able to pinpoint is that we actually, as a business, do not convey our value very well to the consumers. We talk about premium, right? We talk about value. We say you should subscribe because journalism costs money, and turn off your ad blocker because premium journalism costs money, and no one has a general definition as to what premium means. In fact, it actually turns people off and they go elsewhere. So what I was able to, again, identify is that we have no way to quantify premium, right? We don't know how to quantify hours that a journalist puts into their work, or the verifiability of their sources, or the reputation of their authorship. Not just, is this an author, but this author has won 3 Pulitzers and has written for other Pulitzer Prize winning institutions. And that's actually like the real value, right? So I don't subscribe to the Washington Post because they were first on Facebook Instant, right? Or because they have 1 million digital subscribers. I subscribe because Marty Barron curates the news, and I trust Marty Barron. So that is something I'm willing to pay for. That was actually something that was extremely interesting at the Post, but I realized that it kind of had to happen outside the Post. Because it was something that would benefit everyone, right? Everyone in this room, I'm sure, believes that journalism and media is extremely undervalued, and we want to provide more value and think of more ways to value that higher, but none of us really know how. So what attracted me to this space, and to be completely transparent, I was approached to be CEO of Poet back in November, and I never said no fast enough. I was like, I'm not getting into the blockchain. I think Paul back there was published his article. I think Paul published his Bitcoin is stupid, blockchain is dangerous article the day I signed to go to Poet. But I think I remember he said he wrote the same thing about Facebook and Google, so that there's some hope. I really just wanted to identify the why. And again, going back to kind of what interests me and going back in my career, there was a story to be told here. If blockchain falls flat on its face, at least it's made all of us question everything that we do, whether we hate it or we love it. For the first time, we're non-complacent because we're fighting a battle. And what is extremely interesting, and it has been mentioned, and I don't want to continuously reiterate it, but the idea of immutability, right? The idea of verifiability and how you could best take the way that information is stored on blockchain and pair it with incentive mechanisms is interesting. It was interesting at the Huffington Post 10 years ago when we did self-moderation comment badging and did intrinsic incentives to get community members within the Huffington Post to actually aggregate and curate our comments by earning rewards. We went from 5 to 10 to 15, I think, to 20,000 comments per article in a year, which helped us grow traffic, which helped us sell, right, for $320 million. So there is value in incentive mechanisms. There's value in being able to identify, right, something being real versus something not being real, whether that is the future of IP rights management, the future of news curation, advertising targeting, and ad tech is a huge thing that I'm sure Mike could go deeper into. But that's how we ended up here. And, you know, Poet in itself as a protocol is really trying to figure out how we could build a bunch of entry points and accessibility layers that could help with ownership and attribution and IP rights and, you know, a new way to transact, so that we could build some new applications on top of it to really try to see, is there a better way for us to manage rights and syndicate our content and uncover information, not necessarily saying this is right and this is wrong, but we're all playing on a similar field that is exposing certain claims and people can make a choice. One thing that we'll get into further, and I'll just end with this, is that the one thing that I don't want to happen with blockchain, which we're already kind of seeing, is that we're squeezing it and squeezing it. The public notions and a lot of the kind of ideologies around it to becoming similar to what we have now. And I think what we should be thinking about, especially as it comes to curation and delivering information, is that this is meant to expose, right? Like, even though it's not an apples to apples comparison, people are free to smoke cigarettes, right? Like, because we put a label on these cigarettes, it could better influence their decision. And I think that information is a similar thing. I think with misinformation, we're battling it by trying to continue to separate people, but by doing that, we're not actually reaching the people that we want to bring over. So this is a very interesting technology and hopefully an interesting conversation about how to expose that information and how we could build products that could best take advantage of it.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a programmer at a company called Consensus, and I'm a blockchain kid. I had an Ethereum mining farm in my mom's basement in 2015 while I was a student here at Columbia. In retrospect, every time one of my mining rigs went offline, I should have like ran home, fixed it. I could have like retired, but instead I thought that getting a Columbia degree would be useful. I'm most well known for writing a paper called Token Curated Registries 1.0, and then I led the engineering team that implemented what is today like the most widely used production version of that idea. So AdChain launched with that code. Foam, which launched recently as a fork of that code, and Civil is actually a fork of that code base as well. A little like trivia that like not many people know about me, which just like speaks to how weird this space is. In like 2017, I wrote some open source token sale code for like doing token sales. And as far as I know, that code was used by various other people to do at least $40 million of like sales in 2017. And that's just like something, this is like a random thing that happened in 2017. And yeah, so at Consensus these days, I work on a team of engineers and designers that tries to take like kind of interesting ideas in crypto systems, put them into production, observe them, and then use that learning to improve them using further design and engineering.
Nice. All right, well, so I thought what we would try to do is dig a little bit into some of the technologies that you've alluded to and the ways in which they can actually start to support, or the ways in which they're supporting sort of the processes of journalism. And we're going to start with Jared, I think. You know, on the Poet boilerplate, you talk about providing a new way for consumers to find content, a transparent means of tracking who's viewing which stories, where and when, a platform for verifying information, and that verifiability even goes so far as to provide you a kind of nutrition label I've seen mocked up for a source on the web. And you've just described, you know, wanting to sort of pair people's incentives, and I think a lot of what goes on, especially in your work, is an exercise in game theory almost, about trying to figure out how to get people's incentives aligned. So can you say something, Jared, about the design of Poet, like underneath it, and maybe where some of those incentive structures are organized, so you can get people to perform some of the functions that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that the hardest part, right, is getting people to be excited and being able to take advantage of this technology in order for us to build a better overall ecosystem for what we're looking to do. Those tactics are the same tactics that we've always used, like especially, we're speaking to journalists, when you try to implement new technology in a newsroom, if it's not baked within the CMS and something within the existing workflow, it'll never get done, right? We've seen that with things as simple as tagging, right? When journalists will not tag their content, and thus the content lives, elsewhere, and we can never find it, and so forth. So a huge part of this focus is really figuring out what is that identifiable hook that brings value, and then how can we best build a mechanism that gives incentives for people to take advantage of what they could do here. So POET is a claims structure, and what claims basically means are statements or signals or appointments on something that could be validated. So, an author is a claim, or if something is sourced as a claim, or who funded something is a claim, and you could go down the entire list. And there's kind of two tiers to how that protocol works, one of which is how do we get the most content and most information and ideas, whether that's content from Adobe Creative Cloud products or Microsoft Paint to things in WordPress, onto POET, right? So that people could just have their information there, it could live immutably, and there's a hash track record that's persisted to the file that currently exists. That is an open, kind of chaotic farm for people to just put things up there, because as you can imagine, I could put up Mike's TCR article and say that I'm the author, and Mike could put up the same article, and then who's really there to dictate whether or not I'm right or wrong. And then when I want to go license it and take advantage of it, right, we're back in kind of similar situations as we were before. So the first tier is the hook, right? How can we get everyone to put information on here? Why is that valuable? I think you've seen a lot of arguments in the blockchain space be similar, of immutability and ownership and tracking attribution. But the next phase is really where the incentives come in. Why would that information be valuable, and what could it bring? And that really boils down to how could I do things around making money or getting discovery or value out of this information that I created? So a direct example is if you talk to maybe the AP, who's talking later, or BBC, which I know for a fact, when they create their video licensing and when they distribute it, they don't have a smart, sophisticated way to track that, to set those rights. Those rights are often written and from an employee that no longer works there, and how can you hunt those things down? So if all of this information is going within a storage capacity, and then there's an incentive mechanism to say, well, if you do make verifiable claims or validate these things, which often involves a stake and an opportunity to make some sort of incentive that these things are true, then you could earn, right, the opportunity to license this content farther, or you have the opportunity for this to be discoverable if first one amazing day, Google and Facebook and other discovery engines choose to pull POET's Frost API and have reputational algorithms within there. But those are kind of the mechanics behind the why. Is it actually a tool that is valuable, right? And what makes it valuable? And if so, how can you make sure to use incentive mechanisms to then get a better kind of query of that information, so that it's kind of the best of the best, rather than just kind of the way the web works now, where it's just open information that's on you to search and find.
And then the incentives here, the being able to use the content or someone. A lot of the systems that we're talking about, whether it's AdChain or Civil, have underneath them cryptocurrency, right? Is that the same for POET, or?
Yeah. So POET is driven by a currency, POE, that is used for staking against the claim structure. So every time a claim is made, if you want to make that claim verifiable, you put a stake behind it. So if I am taking Mike's article, and if I say, hey, I'm the writer of this article, and I put it up there, there is a community of validators that go in there, and they will say, this is not Jared's article, Jared loses his stake, thus it goes back in the pool, and there's a bunch of different game theory that works on within there. But that's kind of the trust system, where I need to have some sort of stake in the game in order to make these sort of claims that I am willing to lose or be rewarded based on that. So how can we make it really cheap to tell the truth, right, and really expensive to lie? And how can we technically make that happen in a very seamless way that doesn't go outside of workflow? So not a hard task at all. But.
Right.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
How many people do you have actually using that system?
Yeah, so POET has 18,000 individual token holders. Mind you, there are speculators for sure in this space. We, as an open system and a protocol, we have a lot of developers that are building their own applications on top of POET as well, that are thinking about how best to use that token incentive. I mean, POET launched Its token last August, so it's old, old in terms of blockchain, but it's been out there for a while. So there's 18,000 individual holders. There's about 50,000 individuals that are using Poet in general. Again, you do not need tokens to just put information on the chain. If you want to, we have a bunch of WordPress blogs. We have a screenwriter in like New Zealand that stamps all of his screenplays onto Poet before he sends it out to like the agencies, like the old way that you used to mail the script to yourself via snail mail, save the postage stamp, and then send it back out. So like there's different mechanisms in, that people are taking advantage of, but actual holders, which is public, is 18,000.
And so, Mike, sort of building off of the sort of the incentive structure and the currency that's wedged within it, ad chain or token curated registries more broadly have that sort of incentive structure, and in reading some of your and seeing some of your interviews, it looks to me as though being involved in some of these token curated registries has given you a kind of new interest in economics. You were quoted at some point as saying the blockchains have pushed you more toward hyper-capitalism. But I'm interested in I suppose the higher level quote here is that blockchains for you are incredible tools for coordinating people, and we have a lot of sort of big coordination problems. So maybe you can say something a little bit about how AdChain actually functions and how these token curated registries work, like
sure.
how we use them to maintain lists.
Yeah. So I mean, first I'll just say my involvement in blockchains has driven me towards like surrendering to hypercapitalism. Not that it'll, not that I necessarily desire for us to go there. So yeah, I'll explain like a simple version of how TCRs work, and then I can answer the question: why can't you use US dollars to do this? So TCRs are used for curating lists. So let's imagine that all of us in this room, let's imagine that we want to get together and we want to curate a list of the best restaurants in New York City. How could we do this? Like, how could we coordinate, all of ourselves to do this? There's a lot of us here. There'd be a lot of communication overhead. So what we do is we create our own currency called like food coin or whatever. We all get some food coin ourselves. Then the way this list works is, so if you're someone who goes to restaurants, you want to like spend your time at good restaurants. So maybe you go on Yelp, see what's at the top of the page, right? And if you're a restaurant, you want to be on lists of good restaurants. You want to be towards the top of Yelp because you get more customers, right? So what we do with our token is we say, hey restaurants, if you want to be on this list of the best restaurants, you have to buy some of our token on the open market, put it down as a stake to make an application, and then we, the token holders, we're going to check this restaurant out and we're going to decide for ourselves, is this restaurant good or is it bad? And we can all just do this separately, individually. We don't really have to coordinate. We'll all make an assessment. And then if I go and I think the restaurant is good, consumers will like going to this restaurant. I'm like, cool, this restaurant can be in. If we go and a lot of us think that that the restaurant is bad, what we can do is we can put down a matching deposit in the tokens. Now there's 2 deposits at stake. This is a challenge now. So there's 2 deposits at stake of equal size. And then we go to a token weighted vote of all the token holders. So we vote with our money. People who have more exposure to the token's financial upside or downside have more say. So it's not like democratic, it's kind of plutocratic, but hopefully productive. And the reason we do this is because if we let a bad restaurant onto the list, consumers are going to stop looking at our list. If consumers aren't looking at the list, there's less demand to be on the list, and it's the restaurants, the applicants, who are driving fundamental demand for the token. So depending on how that vote goes, one of the deposits is going to get forfeited, and the people on the winning side of the vote are going to get some of those tokens as rewards. Why can't you do this with US dollars? 2 reasons. One is that you can't program US dollars. They're not programmable, and we have just like a non-custodial software program running on a blockchain that like facilitates all of this. There's no counterparty risk. You don't even have to have a company that organizes this as long as we have the code. And then the second reason is, and like a big thing that's interesting about blockchains is that, so like one reason that like US dollars have value is that they're backed by like proof of force. If you like defy the laws of the US, they have burly people who will come get you and do bad things to you. But when we write applications on blockchains, we can just rely on the underlying, cryptographic proof of work algorithm. It's like implausibly difficult to like break any of the rules as stated in this, smart contract or persistent script. And so this like opens up the whole field of like designing economies, which was previously the domain of governments who could like, have a proof of force going on. Opens it up to like any programmer. So that's like, I don't think we've fully figured out what we're going to do with this yet, but it lets us do things like TCRs, for example, which is just one experiment of what'll probably be many that follow.
And it seems to me that creating economies, that experimenting with economies, at least from what I've been able to read, that involves a fair bit of appealing to things like game theory and so on. And so and some of these systems are open to attack, and you sort of lay out sort of what those attacks might be and what the, how one could deal with them. How did whether it's these TCRs or other kinds of sort of experimental economies that you're creating, how does the game theory fit in? Like, how do you have, how is that?
Yeah.
I found some of the results quite interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, I would say, I said this to you before we started, I'm really not a theoretician, I'm like a practitioner. Like, I don't know, people liked that paper, but that was lucky. But what was cool was that once we put ad chain into production, which was the first TCR, we learned more about TCRs in 6 weeks than we had in 9 months of theoretical discussion just about the paper. All the theoretical discussion about the paper was about like bribing attacks and, all sorts of stuff. What we observed in production, which never really came up in the theoretical conversation, is that people just don't participate. Like voting participation in ad chain is like under 1% very, very consistently. Now it's good that we discovered that. So like the way that I described, TCRs to you earlier, based on the observations that we've made and, some experiments that we've run in regards to hoping to fix this, probably not how they'll work in the future. So I'm more like an experimentalist. You have to, TCRs, you can play them as a board game, and I've done this to like teach people how TCRs work. You can literally like have a board game that's TCRs. I think calling it like game theory, at least like, that's like maybe over credentializing, though certainly a lot of people do more, complex work in blockchains than that. But yeah, you just have to have, intuitions around assuming that people like money, which is itself like not exactly a perfect assumption, because people have lives outside of money. If you just assume that people like money, you can design games where, money changes hands and use a blockchain as like the custodian to programmatically move that money around when certain conditions are met.
And if I have it right, the TCRs, the token curated registries, the consumers of that restaurant list get it for free.
Yep.
Right? And it's the people, the restaurants who are applying to get on the list who pay and put up, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's so TCRs then are in effect a kind of, I don't know if business to business is the right framing, but there's sort of the people who want to get on the list are it's not a consumer facing.
Yeah, the businesses in that example are the like customers of the token.
Right.
Yeah.
Which Manoush is a little bit different than the token that Civil was launching, which is definitely a consumer facing token. Could you maybe say something about that experience of trying to sell a consumer-facing token, or what that felt like for you?
Yeah, not good. So those of you who aren't up to date, Civil's token sale failed at midnight on Monday. There's a lot of journalists in the room who maybe even wrote all the articles that came out the next day. And I think, to be clear, like our episode this week was an interview with Civil Media's CEO, and there's a regrouping happening. So I think this is not the end. There's another. It's all going to go back around. Largely thanks in part to consensus, which means that Civil is still centralized and not decentralized. But the concept was, can we get regular people, sort of a very small little sliver of a Venn diagram, right? Like people who are interested in being experimental and new tech with people who really care a hell of a lot about journalism to put down some real money to be part of this ecosystem. And I think the majority, I believe it was 6,000 people who signed up to take part in some fashion, and most of them were Zigzag listeners, because I think it's really hard to understand, and it's really nuanced, and it was 44 steps until 2 weeks into the sale when it became easier, but still not that easy. And so I really think of what we do at Zigzag and what our company was built to do is to be a lab for a lot of these bigger consumer-facing ideas. I think podcasts are kind of perfect for new ideas like this because you have, we're telling stories, and I've really worked very hard over the last few years to create a feedback loop between me and my listeners where they are testing out technology, reporting back on what works or why they weren't interested and people are extraordinarily generous with their time and in terms of responding, even when they're responding like, I think this is shit, I can't stand it, Sybil, I love you, but Sybil's dumb. Or other people who are like, I don't get this whole thing, but I love journalism and I really believe in it, so I'm gonna do it just because I like hanging out with you every week and you think it's worth trying. Or, well, there's not as many who are saying, I don't like you, but okay, good, then they wouldn't listen. But in any case, there's a real relationship there. And I think that speaks to where the tech is, right? That there's nothing to see or touch or feel or prove that this is going to work. And so right now it's based on this idea like, well, we're in this together. And I mean, we've seen that time and time again, right? That's what first adopters do. They sort of are willing to be a little risky. I'm not a first adopter, so if we hadn't gotten a grant, I definitely would not have done this full, but I'm glad I'm doing it. As a journalist, I actually think Nellie was saying that what she does hasn't changed in the last 10 years. What I have done has changed, and I think it has to change for the majority of journalists who no longer work for legacy institutions. You can no longer show up, get your assignment, do your work, and go home. You are an entrepreneur if you are a journalist. You are fighting every day to get paid, and we all have to be switching to that mindset of testing new things and being okay if they don't fail. Or I used to work for the BBC. I would do a live shot. There'd be millions of people watching. It doesn't matter that that doesn't happen anymore. But I have several thousand, tens of thousands of listeners who are willing to respond to me, and I have a deep, deep, deep relationship with them, and we are doing research together, and that is I think very valuable and very exciting.
And just on top of that, because I think you highlight a key thing, which is we, like the royal we, but a lot of people who see encroaching technologies, the first thing is, well, how could this solve a problem that exists today? And if it cannot do that, then it's a solution in search of a problem. And that's something that I'm actually proud that blockchain is, because blockchain in itself, and you kind of hear what everyone's saying up here, is changing behaviors, right? So we have this new technology and these new mechanisms, and we shut them down because they're not able to solve problems that were created before these technologies even existed. And that's just the wrong way to think about it, right? I think what we're able to say is that certain behaviors that we're doing today aren't necessarily the best, and they're not driving the best results, and they could also be driving different problems. So an interesting way to think about blockchain, and I think you saw this in the token sale, and I think you see this when in every pocket of industry that this is looking to influence, is everyone's so quick to say, well, this isn't gonna hit my Q3 goal, right? Or this isn't gonna help me do A, B, and C existing problem today. They're not thinking about what these mechanisms and different ways of thinking are actually gonna change the way that they do things in the first place. And that's what's awesome, right, about this, which will likely create brand new problems that we could then figure out how to solve later, but we're constantly trying to figure out how we could shove this blockchain into these problems, and if they don't fix them, then it's broken. That is not the case.
And I think, so in our first 2 episodes of season 2, we partnered with the Knight Foundation to talk about this new research that they have done into how misinformation spread on Twitter before the 2016 election and then after. And one of the key conclusions, it's not just from this report, is this idea of having technologists with lawmakers who can say to them, common sense doesn't apply like it used to when you're working on a scale of millions, hundreds of millions of people networking together. There has to be an anticipatory nature to some of the problems that could come up, and it's a different way of thinking, and I appreciate that with blockchain, that it is, but that's what makes me wonder, are we talking 5 years from now? Are we talking 10? When are we talking, guys? And I will admit, I think I read this in the awesome New Yorker article about Ethereum. If If you haven't read it, it's great. It's really good. Koi Coin is his example. But he says something that like he was hoping he could get to his grave without having to try and understand blockchain. And I was like, well, that's not possible. It is here. But like that's what I'm curious to know, like in terms of how far into the future are we?
How far are we?
Yeah. So I don't know. So like a weakness of mine is that I say that I have like blockchain blindness. Like I've been involved in it for long enough. Like I'm a power user. You know, like I don't even notice how complicated it all is. You know, when I like kind of stop and say like, oh, if I wasn't myself, you know, what the hell is going on here? Like, what am I actually doing? So there are some like fundamental improvements that we need to make in like the underlying technology, undoubtedly, but we also like industry-wide, if we're going to eventually succeed, need to bring in more design professionals. This has been like a really like deeply techy, nerdy enterprise for most of its life, and I think as it's becoming more mainstream, we are attracting more designers. Like my team is engineers and designers. Very deliberately with that, so I don't know. I am hopeful because I think that if I think back to like someone in the 90s who's getting an email address for the very first time, that like mental jump of like what's this like what's this weird extension at the end, and like so is this going to get faxed to them? Like I feel like that's a larger mental jump than like being someone who lives in 2018 and using the internet and being like, oh, okay, money, but on my computer. So I'm optimistic that we'll get there.
So
it's a little,
I think like I'm living like 1 year into the future. You're like maybe 5 years, and then maybe you're 10. Does that seem about right?
It could be.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, because whenever, like when Nelly was talking about it, going to like hang with the blockchain kids, I really feel of it as more like going through a portal, and I'm like, whoa! And then we get there, and there's all these people speaking like it's like a different language and living a different reality, and like some of them only eat meat, which is a weird subsection, and I just find the whole thing fascinating, but it really, you have to, it's like normal people probably have to like smoke a little weed to get to where they, do you know what I'm saying? Like it's a very different mindset, and I think that actually is a bigger consumer challenge than we think, because there is money involved. Gmail's free. If I screw it up, it's not good, we know, but like, that's what I had people being like, what the heck, I bought Ether, and then it took 8 days to clear in my Coinbase account, and then by the time I went to exchange it in my MetaMask, what the hell is that? I'd lost $300 because the price of ETH had dropped so fast, and then I needed the gas to purchase the civil coins, which then went into my hot wallet, but should I put them in my cold wallet? I don't know. Like, the fact that I just said that sentence 4 months ago, like, I wouldn't have known what I was saying. So, like, it's a leap, and I have been immersed, it is, but I still haven't seen it work. That's the other thing. I want to point that out. Still have not seen it work.
So maybe that next question doesn't have an answer. But like having hung out with the civil kids and going through the process and being one of their startups, if you will, did that change your journalism? I mean, it changed the subject of your journalism for sure. But did that change the way you perform journalism? I mean, you have tokens now. You're participate. Like, did any of the activities?
I don't have tokens. By the way. They have not been issued.
I see.
I have a promise of tokens. Depending on what, that was like one of the arcs of this first season was like, oh my God, are we going to be like rich by accident? And then the answer was no, we will not be rich by accident. No journalist ever gets rich by accident.
Actually, they only get rich by accident.
Right, period. That is true, actually, if they work for certain
the
people.
Power Million is like 900 million this evening.
But I will say, like, ethically, and I think that's another conversation, like, we definitely had people who were like, how the hell can you cover this company when they're giving you a grant?
Right.
But, we've been journalists, like, for a very, like, I remember when you're talking about getting the first email address, and I don't think you were born, maybe. So there's, like, I remember, and I think for us, like, it really was not a conflict. We couldn't help ourselves but be journalists because it's who we are to the core. So
No, it seems like a good perspective. You're in a good place at a good time, right?
Exactly right. Front row to history is what it feels like.
Yeah.
And I think it like requires this jump into the deep end type approach, like going back to how we could change behaviors and also recognize problems. Like again, same thing I said earlier, there's no one in this room that is comfortable with the way that the media model works today and believes that this is going to be the future, right, of how we are going to best set up the journalists and the creators, you know, across a bunch of different sorts of businesses. And what is interesting about these approaches too is this idea of like interoperability. So right now, like a lot of writers' reputation is based on the domain level platform that they write for. So you write for the Washington Post because the Washington Post has all of this reputation, and the New York Times because of all of this reputation, even though you as the writer may have 150,000 followers on Twitter and individual subscribers to your newsletter and all these different things that don't aggregate together. So what I love about these conversations and kind of what we're looking to do at Poet via an identity for creator type tool is how can we start to take reputation away from the domain and put it directly on the creator themselves? And if you have a world like that, what is the role of a company like the Washington Post or a media company? Is it to be the reputation, or is it to be the manager and the operator for that creator and attract them to come and work for you and work directly with you? And you've kind of seen this with advertising and subscription. Like you've seen Ben Thompson very successfully do this on his own, but do advertisers in the future, right, want to advertise with the Washington Post, or do they want to advertise with you no matter where you are because you have a great reputation and subscribers want to subscribe to you, and because of that, NPR says, okay, we want to sign you. And that's where I really love how we're kind of blowing up this whole idea and this whole model, because the model is not sufficient unless everyone wants to consolidate and put less and less value on the work that you're doing as an individual. The Facebook and Google encroachment isn't just like a 90% plus ad encroachment. It's actually creators could go there and create audience and interoperate their audience and make money without having to work for a media brand. So not necessarily going anti-media here. Again, I've worked at 3 great media companies, but I think that that's something that we have to kind of start to talk about and think about what that looks like, and does that help raise the value of everything that we're doing, which in the end I think is the core objective for everyone in this room.
I think that brings up a question that I have not seen, which I would like to see, is the discovery issue, because what you're talking about, it's still really tough, like to find your audience. And on that note, that's part of the reason why Jen and I joined Radiotopia, which is a curated collection of podcasts. Roman Mars, the host of 99% Invisible, created it about 4 years ago. And this collective element, I think, is what I really have loved most about Civil. My first fleeters in the room, like, we are family. It feels like we're on Slack all day long. Also with Radiotopia, you know, there's this group of us. And so this ability to be small yet deep with your reporting still requires, you know, creating an ecosystem so people can find you, because there is so much out there. So, you know, Radiotopia is a mark of quality for podcasts. The hope is that Civil is a mark of quality for good journalism. And I think, you know, that has nothing to do with blockchain, right?
Right. All right, so we should open this up to questions, whether you want to ask questions for 1 year out, 5 years out, or 10 years out. Well,
I edit a B2B magazine, and I'm on the board of the American Society of Business Publication Editors. There are more journalists today working in B2B and professional magazines than there are in all other journalism combined. We all have found our audiences. We all make money because by definition, if we don't, we're dead. I do a magazine for broadband deployers, the people that make the digital age possible. We still actually do it in print, although we have a big online contingency. We only make 30% of our revenue from advertising. We make the rest from consulting, data generation, all this sort of thing. We do a fair amount of stuff on blockchain because it's very important for our readers to do that. So we have an audience. And I'm kind of weirded out somewhat, even though I taught here for 20 years full time, I'm kind of weirded out by this idea of, well, finding your audience, making money, monetizing it, so forth and so on. More than half the journalists in the country are doing fine, and they're totally ignored by the other half, which is going down the tubes. So, you're on.
Vivian, you want to come up here?
I don't need 10 years.
I mean, I think that's fine. There's also like the very thorough investigative work that needs to be done that no one wants to pay for, which is an absolute pillar of our democracy. So you're talking about two very different types of information that there can be, I think. And so I will pay for my subscription to whatever it might be, but I also, like to cruise around on Google News and just see what else there is. But I don't think that Google shouldn't have to give money to the people whose content they are taking. And discovery is left up to them, essentially. When we know that 2/3 of Americans get their news from Facebook, that for free, as curated by Facebook, who does not pay for it, that's a problem. So if there's a way to show people that if this is something that I used to work for public radio, 1-888-376-9692, right? Like, call the number, make your pledge. It works, right? But it's a very specific audience, and you have to remind them and you have to explain to them why it matters to them. There's some people who will do that and other people will not.
And so, just to follow up on that, so the gap.
I don't understand your question.
The question, we make money.
Yeah.
We make money because we produce stuff of very great value.
Yes.
We're no longer making money mainly from advertising. And by the way, that's very typical for B2B publications.
Sure.
If you want sophisticated news on marijuana, there's a dozen magazines in the field. One was the Magazine of the Year last year. Yet much more sophisticated than anything you're going to read in the New York Times or here on NPR. And millions of people are interested. So,
well, I mean, that
I
seems
don't
subjective.
think that magazine,
But it seems subjective that this magazine would be better than anything you read in the New York Times.
I would also say that,
No?
No, not subjective at all.
But what if I
Not
want?
even close.
But
So
what
what's
you're-
the facts
But
that
people
it's
are
better than
reading
anything?
your publications in order so that they can do their business better in order to make more money. But what if I want to know about voting in this country, and it's nothing that's ever going to make me money, but I'm a citizen and therefore I want to be informed.
There are a dozen magazines published today on voting technology, none of which are ever referenced by the popular media.
They don't need there's different levels. I understand that, but there's different levels, right? I am not an expert in voting technology, but I would like to read the New York Times or Nellie writing about blockchain. And I paid for that.
But I pay for the New York Times as well, but the level of sophistication on a very, very wide variety of things that, for instance, public officials need to know, that sort of stuff, is not there. I could, just off the top of my head, give you 100 local major news topics here in New York City that the New York Times doesn't cover.
Correct.
Because the New York Times doesn't have the resources.
That's right.
It's not all that interested in elites and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yet my neighbors up in Harlem care a great deal about something called HR2. It's the farm bill that's going through right now. They care because food stamps are in there. I care because there's funding for rural broadband in there. So I've been following it. So my neighbors ask me, the local newspapers in Harlem ask me, they don't go to the New York Times.
I don't understand.
I don't.
Thousands of communities across the United States, and as a former professor, I'm sure you know this, have lost their ability to get local news. So, for example, the Denver Post, the group of 10 journalists there, who the company was bought by equity partners who want. Okay, so maybe not everybody does. So they have left, right, to form their own company called the Colorado Sun. They are members of Civil. They have grant from there, but they are also finding different ways of finding business models in order to sustain the work that they are doing. One of those is subscription models. They certainly hope to get enough people to pay for that. But the key thing is, right, so not everyone can pay for information. The advertising dollars are not there anymore. The work that you're talking about is extremely expensive, which is why people in business can afford to pay for them. I think I'm not sure. I think we're actually saying the same thing.
I think I'm gonna execute or insert moderator privilege here, and maybe we'll take this offline afterwards. One thing I should say is that I remember one of Sybil's early presentations really emphasizing local newsrooms and supporting local newsrooms through the Sybil effort, and I thought that was quite powerful as a framing device.
Yeah, I think Block Club Chicago is that was DNA Info, that was based in Chicago, which was, of course, shut down. That's another group of them who have formed their own organization that is providing local news down to like the block, literally, in Chicago, and they are using various, not only their grant, but subscription models.
Right.
Everything.
All right, next question
So
over here.
Mike,
Keep your hands up, by the way, if you have, because we'll. Okay.
So I think it's very clear how blockchain can be applied to hypercapitalism. Like, I get that. How can blockchain be applied to radical democracy? And is there actually a future in that, or should folks interested in radical democracy be organizing against the adoption of blockchain technology?
What's radical democracy?
Distribution of wealth, like increasing inequality, increasing democratic participation. It is just a hyper-capitalist thing in a lot of ways. So.
Sure.
He's getting 10 years out. He's got it.
Okay, I mean, I think that no technology will save democracy if people don't work for democracy. There is some interesting approaching production work concepts called liquid democracy and also futarchy. So in liquid democracy, basically it's if I want, as an individual citizen or as an entity with voting rights, I can vote on anything that moves through a legislative process, or I can delegate my vote to someone else, some representative. They may choose to delegate their vote as well, but it's this responsive and adaptive means of allowing people to engage with democracy at any level that they might enjoy. And then futarchy is all about just having people bet on the outcomes of proposals. So we have a proposal for make New York City use a land tax as opposed to a property tax, and then our metric is going to be, is the average happiness of New Yorkers greater in whatever time frame. And if you can resolve that betting market, so I would just bet I really believe that's going to work. I'll put $50 on that. Then depending on how that betting market gets resolved, that is or depending on how the betting market looks, that's what gets implemented as the law. I'm not necessarily super optimistic on blockchains saving democracy. Other people might have.
Well, not saving, but.
Yeah, I think people have to want it.
Yes, here.
Hey, Mike, so you noted that the issue is people have to want to make money or value money in order to participate. But in this case of journalism, there are all these people out there with lots of money who are very interested in seeing journalism fail. Mm-hmm. So how does the blockchain protect itself from people with a lot of money who don't care about losing it to crash the system?
I offer you no defense. Yeah. No, I mean, I would never tell anyone that there aren't dystopian outcomes, in a future with blockchains. Yeah, I mean, that's a 51% attack, and, in TCRs, for example, there's no defense against that.
There is one defense, which is Vivian, which is the civil. In Sybil's world, that problem is being addressed by creating a council of sorts, which Emily is also part of. So the idea being that you're right, people do horrible things to each other. Therefore, there has to be a thing that if things go off the rails, there's a council of people who actually know what they're doing to reset. I like that because it brings the human back into the sort of governance model, and I think that's really important.
Well, thank you very much. I came in here knowing very little about this. My mind is more befuddled now. I'm coming at this with 30 years of experience in public broadcasting and radio. And how I'm processing what you're presenting to me, the lady on the left sort of mentioned this when she's talking about listener sponsorship. This is something one involved in public broadcasting is intimately aware of. That is public support for broadcasting. In this case, through bitcoins or cyber coins, whatever. But to me, that's money supporting a broadcast whether you like it or not. And so what are you learning from best practices about that in terms of your own experiences? Who's doing the best in terms of getting more Bitcoins and cyber money than others? And what are you learning from those experiences?
I could actually speak to this based on the experience of putting the ad chain TCR into production. So again, we went into this with the assumption that because financial incentives exist for people to, take certain actions, they're going to just behave that way. People do not necessarily, do this in practice. And so one of the learnings that we took out of AdChain, or something we would do differently, for a TCR in the future, AdChain did a very traditional, token sale, where we just, sold tokens to whoever, might have liked to buy them. In retrospect, that was probably a mistake because the people who bought the tokens were like speculators. They were people who wanted to go on the YOLO rocket to the moon. What might be more intelligent in the future for people trying to build viable crypto communities that can actually do productive work towards some shared goal is over time, identify who those people are and probably just give them tokens. I mean, selling tokens is only going to be accidentally aligned with producing a valuable result most of the time. So I think over time you want to identify who are the useful people to have in your crypto community, bring them in just by giving to them, and then over time you'll hopefully have built up a viable and vibrant and self-sustaining community. So I do think it's a mistake to just sell tokens into the broad market. It's kind of in evidence that that doesn't work super well.
All right. Is there one last question?
Hi. Yeah.
Everybody's pointing in different directions. Someone speak. Yeah.
So we've had some talk so far about funding models, and then Manoush also mentioned something about discoverability. And something I really wanted to hear people talk about is the impact that existing social media platforms have on that. Because clearly one of the big problems with digital media ad revenue is that it used to be going directly to the sites, and now so much of it is absorbed by Facebook and Google and things like that. So I wondered whether you see the type of platforms that you are building as offering a route around that, or how you think that they will interact with the existing giants of social media.
So one thing I would say is that a big indicator for Facebook and Google is that they don't necessarily want to be the arbiters of truth and like segmentation of information. And you've kind of seen that in the example of when you search for some sort of Google result and there is, a blatant lie in the third result, but that is the most clicked on URL, or when Facebook was labeling everything political ads, even if it's a New York Times cooking thing. So I think these sort of efforts are interesting because, again, if we're looking at exposing claims and information, then this is something that Facebook and Google, who don't necessarily want to be, the traffic cop of what is good and what is bad, can start taking more information and help influence those algorithms. So that's something why what Sybil is looking to do, and AdChain and Poet on a kind of broader scale of information, can we start signaling better values, right? How is this the author? Who created this original piece of content? Going back in the old, when I was at the old Post, at the Huffington Post, we would take a Paul Krugman article, publish it 3 minutes later, do a credit link back, but beat him in SEO and beat him in social, so that we would just always, that was our model. I mean, it was an aggregation model. The day that Michael Jackson passed away, right, the headline was, at the Huffington Post, the headline was Michael Jackson passed away due to drug overdose. And we changed it to Michael Jackson dead because we knew that that's what people would be looking for. So I think the way that those models that you're mentioning, not just from a financial issue, but from a clickbait discovery issue, has actually changed the way that the creative process works. And I think these sort of efforts are interesting because we're saying, how can we better reward how the creative process should be, and how can we then apply that and make that influential on places that people may be discovering. So when Google is surfacing content, maybe it is important to get the attributed writer that created that original piece rather than the aggregator or others who have sourced it, or how do we know things are sourced correctly, and so forth. So that's where I think it's interesting if you think of it as a new set of data and information that could then be applied on top of it, of how best to make these platforms more valuable.
And I would just add, I think that's applicable to more than just journalism. I think, one of the things that I do a lot of work on is this idea of ethical technology, and that maybe we'll get to a place where, a product that has privacy, real privacy protection built into it has some sort of seal. That would be amazing. I know that there's a way to see like which technology is taking your data and profiling you versus ones that you have the option even of paying and retaining some sort of autonomy. Like, I think that conversation is starting to happen, and it's a mark of quality, and it shouldn't just be people who can afford to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key thing that worries me, and I think speaks to what you were saying about hypercapitalism, that question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think we're out of time, but I hope what we saw through the session was applications of blockchain to journalism that allowed for coordination, that allowed us to rethink some of the creative practices we rely on, some of the basics, and how to get readers and the audience involved. So let's thank our speakers.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Mark, and panelists. And hypercapitalism, radical democracy is something we will probably get to in the final panel, but we're having a short break now, so we'll resume at 3:30. Just a kind of housekeeping note, this is an open campus, people wander in and out, particularly when we have events on. Just keep an eye on your stuff. Okay, and we'll see you at 3:30. Thanks.
Hello, hi. We're gonna get started in about 10 minutes. So grab some tea and coffee in the back. Thank you. Can you find your way to a seat? We have many seats in the first 2 rows. We want you to be comfortable.
Great. Okay, final session. Well, this has been a terrific afternoon, and I was just saying to the panelists that just as it was getting interesting about late-stage capitalism and radical democracy, we cut the break. So we're going to go right back into it. So the final panel of the afternoon is entitled Blockchain Governance, Sustainability and Risks. And I think we've kind of like touched on some of these, but I don't know that we've actually kind of gone deeply enough into any of them. We have a brilliant panel here to introduce that topic. And as before, I'll go to the audience, so have your questions ready. And then after that, you can all have a lovely rest. So I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves, not because I don't know who they are, because their names are here, and just do a couple of minutes on, if you like, a sort of an opening statement of what they do, what they think about this, and then we'll sort of talk through not just kind of, how we assess the risks, sustainability, and governance issues, but I think also have some kind of practical examples about what does it really mean to operate blockchain technologies, and how should you start to think about kind of setting up those systems if you are, for instance, a publisher. So, Salah, can I start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Emily. And thank you all for having me. My name is Salah Zalatimo. I'm the head of product and technology at Forbes Media. We just recently announced a partnership with Civil to start experimenting on their blockchain. I've been following and kind of trying to learn and understand the blockchain for some time now. It actually led to the creation of a task force internally at Forbes, and that culminated in this partnership. And I am very bullish on the blockchain technology, but still very curious to see how it actually plays out.
Hi, everyone. Is this on? I think so.
Yes,
I'm
we can hear
Alexia
you.
Betta. I'm an associate at Claris Law. We're a media boutique here in New York. And what we do is we advise journalists who are getting their content out there on how to protect it, how to defend themselves, and really how to make the most of their content and other content providers as well. I first started getting into blockchain about a year ago when people in this room came and met with us in our office and shared this great idea about journalism on this thing called the blockchain. And for a long time, been thinking about it and still feel very much, Ronnie Chang, who's a great comedian, asked Joe Lubin at a conference recently, can you explain blockchain with words that were not created in the past year? And that's something that resonated with me for a while and still does, and it's been really fun grappling with it.
Hi, there. Everybody looked up. Good to see you. It's that third panel on Friday feeling. It's really exciting. I'm glad to get your attention.
We've got them coffee.
That's
so
right. There's coffee
yeah.
in the back. We won't be offended if you get up and get coffee. My name is Paul Ford. I am the co-founder and CEO of a software company called Postlight. Before that, I was, among many things, a editor at Harper's Magazine, which is great preparation for being a software CEO, and also a writer about technology, including blockchain. So I've been following this technology for a long time. I actually still don't understand it in any meaningful way. And I think that the value I might be able to bring here is talking to lots of blockchain companies and trying to understand it and working in a software firm where people come to us with blockchain-related ideas and ask us to build things. One of them is standing in the back of the room in a green shirt. And we've had lots of conversations with people and trying to understand how this world's going to fit into the world of like giant consumer software that people actually use instead of talking about.
So, Paul, I'm going to kind of start with you because you've sort of slightly undersold yourself, I feel, on being, you're kind of like a latter-day prophet to those of us who don't quite understand what is going on in this world, or we think we understand it, and then somebody who is smarter and more eloquent comes and points out all of the things that we might have overlooked. And in reading your writing about blockchain, that's very much the feeling I got. You've done a couple of kind of terrific critiques of it. I just wonder if you could lay out some of the challenges and problems that you identified in your writing.
Sure. I mean, I'll stick with the perspective. I will. We've talked a lot about journalism. I'll just talk about I work at a company and run a company that builds and ships software to the wider market. And some of the things we build have millions of users. And one of the examples that got brought up, and it was a little painful to see, was the Civil token sale. And I think everyone, including the leadership of Civil, was like, oof, boy, that didn't go well. And people use that to beat up on journalism and the blockchain. But what I saw was just a problematic product launch, of which I've been part of many, right? Like it's an idea, and it was something that went out into the market, and it wasn't quite ready, and some things went wrong. And that happens all the time, and it's kind of how you react to it, right? So we're in this zone where we are launching these very early stage, very somewhat confusing, not quite consumer-facing products. And they're as to the blockchain technology itself, right, I'm looking for simple abstractions that I can put programmers against and count on getting some kind of reaction. So like if I wanted to do something with Gmail, let's say I wanted to make like a new Gmail search engine or a Gmail visualizer, I would take a programmer and I would say, go to Google, get a developer key, go get the access to the API, so the service, the web-like service that lets you download information from Google and from the API, and do something with it, program against it and so on. When the blockchain technology doesn't quite work at the API level yet, it's not simple enough to grab on, and it pretends to, but then they'll be like, but it's slow, but it's complicated. So we're just in this weird zone, and as someone who builds more traditional software, I have the luxury of being kind of blessedly unconcerned. Like this might take 10 years to work. It might take 10 years to be fast enough. It might take a long time. I was there for the whole internet wave, and I remember being incredibly eager for the future that I saw to show up. And it took 15 years for that future. And we had to get through pets.com, and we had to get through all kinds of, I literally in 2001, I thought, my God, the bottom has dropped out of the internet. I need to do something safe like publishing. That's a real thought. Because I made like 18 grand that year from my software and web development work. And then I was like, well, I'm doing better as a freelance writer. Like, I don't know if that will ever happen again.
That will never happen again.
No, I know. So to wrap it up, I just think like we've got a lot of abstractions. We've got working technologies. Like that's never the question. We have a certain amount of humanity that is willing to believe that tokens can be, that is willing to sort of financialize abstractions in their brains and then say, sure, this feels like money to me. The vast majority of humanity is not interested in that unless it's worth $20,000 and they can get in early, right?
Can you just say what you mean by financialized abstractions?
Well, that's what I'm still trying to figure it out, right? Because this is the big puzzle to this is people show up and they're like, I have this amazing new thing and it functions as money. And then you have to kind of go through the whole like, well, fiat currency and it's not gold anymore. And it's just, there's all these assumptions in culture that this blows up, that blockchains blow up, when, especially when they become financialized as forms of currency and start to trade against, stable coins and Bitcoin and sort of all the various things that happen to make these things feel and act like money. And that just gets really confusing. Money's confusing. It's emotional. And it doesn't, the web used to be like, and the internet used to be like, hey, no more scarcity. Have a bunch of digital assets. Enjoy yourselves. Feel free. Pirate. And now it's like we have introduced, it's now impossible to get access to anything and incredibly slow. Check out the future. And also that's money now. So it's just puzzling. Like it doesn't feel right after 20 years of internet or, 30 years of internet. And so, and there are people who get it, you get it, like you feel it in your heart, right? But I just have never been able to feel it in my heart. And so I've never bought any blockchain, I've never bought any Bitcoin or anything like that.
Okay, well, let's hope that that's a decision that's as good as your decision about freelance writing. It's unfair. Alexia, so bad news is often good news for two categories of people, journalists and lawyers. So when you talk us through what you see as being, and when you're advising news, it's all civil newsrooms, you're advising journalists. How are you kind of approaching, first of all, this new technology, and secondly, if you like, kind of liability and risk?
Sure. So how many people here produce content in some way, whether it's written, film? Right, so questions we all ask if we're producing content is, how can I protect my content? How can I monetize it? And how can I stay safe? How can I defend it if something goes wrong? And what's interesting with blockchain is it's a little bit a double-edged sword for each of those categories. How do you protect it? There are a lot of opportunities to protect it because there's a record of it. There's a record that it happened. We were discussing this a bit earlier, like what is there actually a record of? And there's a lot of confusion and demystifying that I think has to go on about this, about what is actually on the chain when you're a journalist. Is it your story? Is it a record that the story was written? What do we mean when we say that you can never take it off? So there's this notion that it's protected because it's always there. And maybe the technicalities of that, either of you are a better place to speak to, but there's definitely this idea, which is interesting for journalists, is that it's always there. And that can be a bit a double-edged sword because it's great if it's always there, but what if suddenly you need it not to be there anymore? What if for security reasons you're writing from somewhere where it's not good for your story to be associated to you anymore? It's not good to be even associated that you've written about this topic or that you've written on this platform. Depending on exactly which information is in the chain, that's always going to be there. There's also protecting your content, especially for photographers on the chain, or as a journalist, if you want to know what kind of pictures you can use, how to know. There's a lot more opportunity to know about copyright infringement, to know by hashing a picture whether that picture actually has been created before. So that's for protecting. Monetizing, we spoke about it before. Being a journalist today, if you're not writing, this was the point that the earlier panel made, if you're not writing for a legacy paper and you're much more of an entrepreneur, there are very interesting tools now for payment with the blockchain, with how you can be paid for your story, so that also potentially solves for that. And then for the lawyers, really interestingly, the liability question, right? And here I think you have to think about it differently, and we certainly think about it differently between the journalist liability or the platform. And in terms of being a journalist on the blockchain, the process that you're going through to make sure you're not liable is the same as if you were publishing anywhere. A lawyer is vetting your story, they're looking for issues. If you're defaming someone, are you revealing a private fact? That process is the same whether there's blockchain behind it or not. Where it gets interesting for liability is the platform. Because, for example, take YouTube. The reason YouTube can do what it does is because YouTube is not liable for any copyright infringement of its users, right? Because it's this thing called the DMCA, which means that if you're a platform and users submit content onto your platform, you're not liable for user-generated content, so long as if you get notice of it, if YouTube finds out, you tell YouTube, hey, you've got my content, take it down, and YouTube takes it down, they're in this safe harbor. How does that translate to the blockchain? Because with this issue of immutability, if you can't take it down, but what are we taking down? Are we talking about taking down or depublishing? Are we just saying that, sure, the record of the story will always be there, the record that it was done, this transaction will be there in the blockchain, but you can depublish the story, right? So if somebody publishes something on Civil, when you log on to the website and you're looking at it, the story can be, the front user, what you're looking at can be different. But that would be more depublication than a takedown, and so it remains to be seen if the courts are gonna buy this notion that with blockchain, depublishing is the same as taking something down, and that you avail yourself as the platform of the defense. So that'll be really interesting. We think that it should. You know, when the New York Times takes something down, somewhere in the archives of the New York Times, the story's still there. They've essentially also depublished it. So by analogy, we think blockchain should be the same, but
right. So you need to, can you just answer smart contracts? So what is so smart about them, which is the frequent question.
I think smart contracts, the word is a bit of a misnomer. It
Right.
sounds great.
Okay, good. I thought it was just me.
Yeah, no, I think a smart contract is a bit of a misnomer. A smart contract is not suddenly this entire contract is all self-executing, it's smart, it somehow has a life of its own. I mean, that would be awful. That's not what a smart contract is. A smart contract, what you're really saying is there are parts of this contract that can be reduced to self-executing code. So for example, an example that'll speak to the people in this room, licensing, right? Every time somebody accesses my photograph online, I get paid X cents, which is a really attractive proposition because it's very hard to monitor right now. And if you can do that with blockchain, that's a really attractive way for content creators to be paid. So it's that little piece of the contract which is smart. It's not necessarily the entire contract itself. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, but I think it really means self-executing piece of code that unlocks somebody else's key to their wallet on the chain.
So Salah, you're in the sharp end of this, if you like. So you're actually a publisher you've joined Civil, you're thinking about what it means to be a publisher on the blockchain and what those risks are. Talk us through why you took the decision to join Civil and also kind of how you assess the advantages of it for you as a publisher, but also what the risks might be that you haven't figured out yet.
Sure. So about a couple of weeks ago, we announced our partnership with Civil, and I would say this process started almost a year ago. We started trying to, my background, I'm an entrepreneur, and I see blockchain coming on the scene just like the internet did in 2001, and it's something that piques your interest. And so I started looking into it on my own time, and then started quickly realizing that this is going to really hit our business at some point, maybe not immediately, maybe not in the next couple of years, but at some point in the next 5 years. And so the conversation, and as you can imagine, I'm sure everyone here can relate to this, in our organization, it just kept popping up in different places at different times. Somebody on the sales team would say, oh, one of our clients is asking us about what our blockchain strategy is. Someone in the newsroom is saying, I heard about the Colorado Sun just opened and it's fully on the blockchain. Why don't we do that? Someone on the legal team gets really concerned about what happens if things are permanently attached to it, and we have a lot of content we want to take down, and we're not sure if it should be published or stay out or edited. And so we decided to create a task force internally, which was myself, the CEO, our corporate development team, our editorial team. And the purpose of that task force was to meet once a week and bring in experts or just active players in the blockchain space to actually come in and do a little bit of a discussion and a show and tell with us. And what we quickly realized was that this is not getting easier. Like it's not like after 5 meetings, oh, got it, blockchain makes sense now. It was not the case.
That's great news for everyone in this room. They're excited for our next conference.
Exactly. So, and I mean it. I mean, still, we would, at the end of every meeting, they would walk out and we'd kind of scratch our heads and be like, so I don't get it. What's the point? Why I don't understand what we can do with that we're not doing today. And the answer, honestly, is nothing. Right now, there is nothing that the blockchain will enable that you can't already do. And so that's actually why we decided to join Civil, because we realized that if we just sit here and keep trying to watch from the sidelines and try to understand this and try to predict it and see what's going to happen, it's never going to go anywhere. And there's lots of analogies like this, but I think Warren Buffett was famous for saying, sell when people, or buy when people are afraid and sell when they're greedy. It's kind of a similar mindset, which is like, people run when they're afraid, but maybe this is our time to move into it, because it's so amorphous and it still needs to take shape. And Forbes, from a little bit self-serving standpoint, we have a pretty unique business model in that 80-90% of our journalists are freelance, they're contributors. And so that makes our business a little bit unique in the way that we manage and edit and oversee content. And so we felt, if all other publishers seem to be afraid of this, maybe this is a good opportunity for us to step into it and see if we can just learn directly from it and get some experience. And let some developers on my team touch it and feel it, and let some staff journalists actually start writing on it. And then actually maybe we can, lean this in a direction that's really beneficial to us, and we can create our own blockchain one day and really unlock the power of it in a kind of very specific way to our business model.
So, Paul, you're kind of the unconvinced person. One of the unconvinced people.
I'm not unconvinced or convinced. Like I said, I just have the luxury of not having to decide. It's software. It's software that's functional, and if you can use it to create better experiences or give people a sense of control over their environment, that's great. And a lot of the problem I see is a lot of the blockchain related software is just a very low quality, like the distributed apps around various tokens are kind of messy and feel old school. But then again, if you look at the web of 1994, it really looked ridiculous. And so,
well, that was something I sort of wanted you to draw that analogy out a little bit, because as you say, kind of, we all remember sort of, the thrill of the idea of open source, and then kind of actually sort of it was great for certain things, but it just wasn't very useful, and it wasn't very well supported.
Yeah, I ran Linux on my desktop in the 90s, and it was a mistake, right? Like, it was actually terrible for my career. I couldn't exchange Word documents.
Right.
But I believed, and I loved it. It was fun. To that point, it's true. The whole damn thing is one giant animated under construction GIF. That's right. And those were very meaningful, because you were like, oh my God, I'm here. I have to make something. And then you're like, I need to communicate to people that I'm claiming this little bit of territory. I'm going to put up an under construction GIF, and then I'll come back. Most people didn't, but some did. And that is the seed. Like, if you didn't have that under construction GIF, I don't know if people would have gotten as connected to the web as they did. You need that vacuum that humans are hungry to fill. And so right now there's a lot of vacuum. There's some interesting stuff, and there are millions of people who are kind of connected or engaged in different ways, which is a hell of a seed to build from. It's just that, so where I am is just like, sure, great. Like, I mean, if a token sale is like Civil, I'm very connected to. I know Maria Bastilis very well from Popula and her puppy.
Yep.
Yeah, she's great, and it's like, and I'm sorry to harp on it, but Vivian said earlier, like, if it had been it should be one click. If it was one click, I would have thrown a couple $100 in, because I believe in what Maria's doing. And when it is one click, I will. Right? Or 10 clicks. I'm cool.
Right.
I'm still. What's that?
Not 44.
44.
If we can get it down to, yeah.
Exactly. And it's just sort of like we're in that zone, and I have been responsible for 44-step processes in my own life, and so I have empathy that way. It's just going to take a minute.
Right.
Or 5 to 10 years.
Right, and so, but on this sort of on this governance point, I guess so when I'm looking at or thinking about sort of really concrete examples, and Mike gave a great example about the restaurant review metaphor in the last panel. I guess we had a kind of a very concrete example in something like the sort of the battle over, or the closure of Gawker. When we start to see a sort of a publishing horizon, and I think it's probably going to be I hope, pretty rare in America, but it's actually very common in other parts of the world, where organizations are news organizations are erased from, the face of the record one way or another. Can actually blockchain really deliver on that promise? I mean, it seems to me that there's always a governance structure which is stronger than technology, and that's, government or very powerful, rich individuals. Is this any different? Anyone who wants to take that?
I don't think that this will be. I don't think this is impervious to manipulation. So, the individual coin transactions seem to be impervious. It is a very complex algorithm and large hash, but everything, to your point, everything has a vulnerability and has a weakness, and there are choke points and gateways, and things can happen. 30 years ago, the internet sounded the same way. It was a great democratizer, and it will free everything and everyone. No one thought that ISPs would consolidate, and now Verizon can look at all the data coming out of your device. You forget about the actual browser and whatnot.
I think to that point, right? Decentralization is robust. Encryption is robust. Like you could, but you've also got the Verizons of the world who are going to be beholden to various kinds of FISA requests and all the things that come their way. And so, if you have a giant distributed encrypted file system where nobody knows quite what's on it at any given time, but you can retrieve assets, like that's now conceivable. You could also just flip the internet, like they, flip off the switch, like they've done in various countries during protest movements. So it's all possible. What you'd need, what's going to change and what could change is you could have an environment where there's lots of people with really cheap computers that are federated with each other without the giant company in the middle. We're not there yet, but the technology's certainly showing up. If that happens and there are good actors on the network, something like a blockchain is great, right? Mm-hmm. It's because you've got the decentralized hardware as well, and so there's ways this could happen, but there'd have to be that demand. There'd have to be that desire for humans, and it's hard.
Right, and as you say, it's in particular people can't really kind of envisage what it is, and there is no UX that really meets the promise. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just say, the demand for creating it needs to exist, and there needs to be a lack of demand for undermining it as well, because that's actually the.
I mean, yeah, we're here.
There will never be a lack of demand for undermining it, will there? I mean, this is kind of like, we are entering, I don't know whether it's just because I spend too much time working in a journalism school and talking to other apocalyptically minded individuals, but kind of like sort of everywhere I go, people reiterate the Marshall McLuhan quote about the next world war is in cyberspace and there's no division between civilians and the military. Sorry, I know it's Friday afternoon, this is not very upbeat, but that kind of, I mean, am I being sort of too dystopian about this? Or is there, I'm looking at you, Paul, when I say the word dystopian, or how dark could this get and how much might we need these kinds of networks?
You never go wrong assuming that the worst thing, it's, like if you look at one of my rules about the internet is when you want to know what the next big thing is, like look for the thing where you're like, that's absolutely horrible and everyone is terrible. Like I remember, I said those words about Twitter. I'm like, that will never, no one will ever want that. It's awful, right? And now it runs our industry. I don't know. We're also backed into a corner here because journalism's in a pickle. And so we're this panel could also be called like, journalism, what's the cure? And so we're struggling with that. We're trying to take something that is not ready for the world and trying to fix something that is having a terribly hard time. And it's an experimental, we're putting a baboon heart into journalism right now called blockchain.
We are putting a baboon heart into journalism right now. That is actually, I'm going to have that on my business cards. That's right. Cardiologists to baboons.
But it's a distributed ledger.
It's immutable.
But you can track baboon hearts using the system. It's really great.
That's right. Yes, no one knows whether it was really a baboon that gave you the heart.
Alex, that bad actor question, I think, is a good point. We constantly look and herald blockchain as the answer to fake news, which we can all hope that it is. But that is based on the assumption that the majority of the people who are going to be putting in the time to say that something is right are the people who have truth as the best interest at heart. And I think that's often an underlying assumption that, you know, the people in this room are going to make. But I don't know, if you have this conversation in different communities, are the majority of the people who are going to look at a story necessarily the people who are after the truth? Maybe, maybe not.
Do we know what the Kremlin is doing about blockchain? I mean, serious question. You know, so in sort of counterintelligence. And
No, but it's got to be on the radar as like a
Right.
very, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure if it's probably a couple Google searches away. There's going to be stuff.
Well, we also don't know who actually created it. So, you know, there's still that moment that Putin
Yeah.
takes the mask off and it's actually
It was
he's
me.
He's Satoshi Nakamura, right? I mean, ha ha ha. But
I don't know that this is actually helping kind of like create great
I do think-
confidence in the system. But
I do think there is one thing that we could actually impact here that really could help preserve the better intentions of the blockchain, and that would be having as many different blockchains as possible.
Right.
The ultimate undermining of this is that we all end up on one blockchain.
Right.
Like one internet.
Yes.
It was not supposed to be the case.
Yeah.
Somehow
I
it
think
happened.
Facebook do have a team working on this as well. I mean, but that, I mean, again, this is a kind of a serious question, right? It's like the same questions that we have about AIs. And, you know, Alexia, your point, I think, is a really good one about, like, let's just imagine a threat model version of this, which is emerging elsewhere. You know, what about things like kind of doxing on the blockchain? You know, kind of if all of that information could be made, you know, permanent, or, you know, all of the kinds of things that we want to wipe off the internet. Is there a kind of a, you know, the sort of is there a good reason to kind of try and regulate now before all of this becomes beyond our control? I'm European, so I always want to regulate everything. I just see it, and I see it, and I want to regulate it.
And that's what's happening in Europe a lot. I mean, people are saying left, right, and center that it's the death of the internet. It's that memes are going to die in Europe because of the new copyright regulations. That's what people say, which is tragic to lose memes.
Europe, the place where memes go to die. It's like,
I don't think it's like anything. It's like any kind of technology, whether we're talking about blockchain, augmented reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence. It's a really fine balance between doing this kind of thing, thinking about it, getting minds into a room, looking at the best case, worst case scenario. You can do that and make a lot of progress and get the community thinking, because at the end of the day, the community doesn't. We saw what happens when you have congressional hearings, and it's quite alarming to see the people who would be regulating things like the blockchain, how much they know about technology. I mean, we saw the questions that were asked of Zuckerberg. So I'm always hesitant to push for regulation too quickly, not to give the technology time to breathe and grow, even if it has to make certain mistakes. While at the same time, I think it's important to encourage these kind of conversations and talk and get minds together in a room. And there's regulating and there's regulating, and regulating doesn't always have to come top down, I think.
right, Manjeet, Salha, the point you were just making about many blockchains or one big blockchain, kind of like what this, just a sort of scalability point on sort of social scalability, you know, is the best chance for that public blockchains or private blockchains? I'm not sure, I don't really understand enough to know how that would work, but clearly it's something you've thought about.
It's a great question. I think that ultimately it would be private blockchains. I think there is a real interest, in everybody's interest, for there to be a journalism blockchain, at the minimum, journalism blockchain, maybe certain contract blockchains, maybe even within journalism there being different parts of journalism blockchain, there being a tech coverage and a business coverage. And the more you can disaggregate it, the safer it becomes. The key to this is creating a single point of failure. So, I mean, even the point that Paul had made before, does everyone here even know that countries can literally turn off the internet? That a government has a light switch where the whole internet turns off? I mean, obviously, if that's the case, then you could also just read what's going through that point as well, turn it on, off, slower, faster. So that single point of failure is the ultimate threat. And so in order for there to be, and as you kind of alluded to, if the government does this, it's way more efficient to have one. It'll be cheaper to operate, it'll be faster, it makes a ton of sense in so many ways. That's why there's only a few telecom companies and media companies, et cetera. So it has to be the people that actually want that to be disaggregated to remain that way.
There's just a tension in everything we're talking about between, like, technology has just become real life. Like, the government, you can't just go do revenge porn on the internet anymore because there are laws, and it took a minute for everything to catch up, but it was clearly illegal and bad when it was happening. Like, it was just, and everyone's like, well, it's on the internet, and then suddenly people are like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? You can't abuse people in that way, and we know who did this, therefore we have to stop it, right? So the real question becomes, like, what level of anonymity are we going to allow, and how, and where are we going to insert fail-safes? And many of the people, I think there's like and then it gets even trickier because, Bitcoin was supposed to be quite anonymous as to who the individual was, while their wallet and their identifier could be tracked by the transactions they make. But I think the Department of Justice at one point called Bitcoin's prosecution futures because they were able to track dark web transactions by who had the wallet. And once you could make one connection and figure out who one person was, you could start to just do old school law enforcement work, and you could break them. And you could say, well, who were you trading with? Did you know? And there'd be an email. So there is this possibility of like a purely decentralized, super anonymous secret network, but most likely it's still humans, and increasingly it's governments, and there's also an assumption in technology that everybody is stupid, and after like a certain amount of time, other people get smart and figure out how things work, and then they go work in places that aren't technology.
Right. And when you say everyone is stupid, everyone except people who work in technology.
Except the dudes at this meetup.
Right.
That's
okay.
That's.
I'm going to open it up for questions because I know there's kind of like a ton of questions out there. So put your hands up. But I also wanted to, if we circulate we start over there. I also have terrible eyesight, so you really have to put your hands up. Yep. Go ahead.
Early on, you spoke of depublishing. I'm familiar with the California Court of Appeals of depublishing, but that related to statutes. Has any journalism publication been ordered by the courts to, quote, depublish anything that has been out?
No, so that's why the words that are used now by the court are the words in the statute, which is to take down. It's a notice and takedown procedure. And the point I was making is that the word takedown and the concept in the area of blockchain doesn't really make sense because it's not so much a take down, it will be a depublishing of the story. So whether courts are willing to buy that a depublication is the same or tantamount to a takedown, that hasn't been tested yet.
That has not been tested yet. But that surely could only be directed to the original publisher. That is, and consequently, don't the courts understand distribution of...
You would be surprised that the courts understand.
No, I wouldn't.
Of course. I worked at The Guardian when we were given a sort of a contempt of court. Well, everybody was told that they had to take down all the stories relating to a case because of contempt of court. And there had to be some very detailed discussions with the judge about what exactly that meant and how you couldn't just disappear everything off the internet. Well, this was it. This was in the 2000. This was about 2005 or something, and just not understanding how the internet worked. That we couldn't just recall and delete every single version of the story for a period of 6 weeks and then kind of republish it again. So it's sort of
Can I touch on that actually? Both
sure.
those points. There's actually the blockchain can enable something more powerful in this regard.
Right.
Because one of the things that we're looking at is how do we syndicate content using the blockchain, and it could allow a publish once appear in multiple places type of functionality. So the point where you depublish something could actually be more powerful than taking it down, because if you take it down from our site, it could still live in other places where it was syndicated. But if you have it published and syndicated to the blockchain, you can turn it off once, and it will turn off everywhere. You could also put a smart contract in there and tell it to republish 10 days later, and it will do that automatically.
That's amazing. That would say that that's put some.
Have the power and where would authority be directed to turn it off?
The initial publisher.
interested, the topic of the panel includes governance, and I'm interested in this vision, right? So one of the big appeals of all of this technology is the decentralization, right? You don't have to have the government or Facebook or somebody in charge. And so who is in charge? Well, various consensus mechanisms. Vivian, I think, talked about one of the values of the coin is that, you know, or somebody talked about, you know, one coin, one vote, and the idea that you essentially can buy control. And I'm just wondering, who likes the idea that whoever spends the most money has the most say about what is true and what is not true?
Imagine a society where that
right?
was.
So, and that's implicit in every single thing we've seen here is the person who has the most coins has the most votes. So you guys at various points, do you like that? Do you not like that? What, and how does that play out? If any of these things takes off, and there's a question. Should it be published? Is it true? Is it trustworthy? And dollars or bitcoins.
Okay, so as I say, in this weird parallel universe where strangely the people with the most money get to dictate voting and information systems, if you can imagine such a horror being visited on us, but this is, I mean, this is quite seriously, this is a flaw which is talked about a lot, which is okay, kind of, you know, this is meant to be decentralized. Are we not just like going to be remaking all the problems that we currently have with, you know, kind of like the centralizing web in a slightly different monetized form?
I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I don't think the technology solves anything. I don't think it creates any good. I don't think it does anything good or bad. I think the people that use it do things that are good and bad. And so I think, you know, the way that plays out, we'll see. But, you know, I don't think that is a condemnation of blockchain. That's just a condemnation, potentially, or a validation of these people's application of it.
Well, you can't. Yeah, sorry.
It's a system that's built on the incentive being a financial reward, and that, I mean, I don't really see. I agree with you, and it's what makes me uncomfortable with it. But it's kind of, to me, it's baked in. I mean, that's the incentive is a token, a Bitcoin, an Ether, a Civil, and I don't know how you get away from that while keeping this idea of incentive being monetization. It would be a system where the incentive is something else, but I don't know what it would be.
Well, there's a sense of citizenship, right? But we don't, you know, I own a larger portion of my company than other people do in the company, myself and my co-founder. And so we have more say and more sway, and it's perpetuating that at some level, perpetuating that certain individuals buy in and have more control. It's not citizenship as we understand it, and that doesn't seem to be a topic that comes up a lot in this world. It's sort of like being a citizen, because it's not really a world yet. And we never got there with the web. There were always topics, there was always a discussion about, you know, what does it mean to be a good digital citizen, and how do you link to things, and what should it be? And then when the giant platforms came away, they sort of took away the oxygen. And up until like, you know, your Twitter and your Facebook shows up, people were making things online and talking about making them more accessible and so on. Relatively small community, nowhere near what it was like today. But that conversation changed, and it feels like we maybe have even skipped over that point. There's no conversation that I know of about like being the really, like how this could enable, there's an issue of equitability that's just not in the water as much.
Right. There was, there's a hand there. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I say very bad eyesight. I can't see who's got the microphone, so.
So the panel spoke briefly on fail-safe, so I want to give you a chance to kind of expand on that a little bit, because it seems like whether it's security and obviously the advantages of blockchain for decentralization and encryption, et cetera, or if it's ease of use through smart contracts and licensing, it seems to me that we're putting a lot of faith in the automation that blockchain resolves. We're putting a lot of faith in the technology. And it's like, just looking back, it seems like putting a lot of faith in technology is not a good idea.
Right.
And so my question to you is, as we're building these technologies and these blockchains, et cetera, what are the levers that we as humans, as as participants in this blockchain, can pull? You know, is it like Wikipedia, where there are editors unbeknownst to us? What's that like?
I mean, I think this is kind of like, again, a point. We've got to a point where we can start to design, where we can still design systems that, you know, are idealistic, even if they don't actually kind of, you know, endure. But that's a good point about if you're designing your fail-safes into this. I don't know, Alexia, you're a lawyer. Have you thought about what the right kind of fail-safes would be in any of these systems?
The fail-safe depends from the concept, from the perspective of who. The fail-safe for the publisher, the fail-safe for the platform. The fail-safe for the platform remains the same as the fail-safe for a platform in normal print publishing. It's you want to remain a platform, right? If you want to be safe on the blockchain and not be liable on the blockchain, you want to be sure that you're considered a platform on the blockchain and not a publisher, because there are a lot of liabilities that platforms don't have when they're just a platform as opposed to a publisher of content. So a lot of the thinking goes on, a lot of the advice that we've given is very similar, at least from a media lawyer's perspective, right? I'm probably not the best, I'm not a blockchain lawyer in the sense of the technology of it, but at least from setting up your business as a media business on a blockchain, it actually ends up being very similar to how you protect yourself in print.
Right, what about the fail-safes for, you know, as it were, kind of society, Paul? What would that be?
I think that the deal is like, this will be, here's your white paper and here's your open source code on GitHub, and figure it out, and if you want to participate and run a node, you know, you're going to receive these kinds of transactions, and you're going to store them and be part of this big decentralized database, and you've had access to all the information that you might need in order to decide if this is going to work or not. And so once you set up that infrastructure, you're going to keep going, and it's really hard to change it once it's turned on. And so I think it's just early days too, so like change is hard once you've set up, and the whole point of this thing is it's immutable and kind of keeps going forward. And so that's the deal. The deal currently is get in here and, you know, turn it on, and let's just hope it all works out okay. Which, I mean, you know, Bitcoin was a white paper, and it was some code, and it was a very vague idea about centralized banking, and it just caught fire. And it wasn't entirely new as an idea. It was ripping off of lots of stuff that came before. So it just got really big really fast, which these things tend to do. But no, I mean, to me it just sort of feels like, I mean, there are ways to change things and modify rules after a blockchain is out into the world, but it really does feel like there's a big switch, and when people buy in and turn it on, and it's really hard to go backwards, and that's the current cultural moment.
So yes, yep, sure.
I just want to, going off what Paul just said, there used to be a utopian vision of all this. It wasn't so kind of plug the leaks kind of an idea. Like Ted Nelson had this idea of Project Xanadu a long time ago. You know, the guy who first theorized hypertext in 1967, that we'd put stuff online and the Visa card would be charged, you know, 3 cents to read yours, and you'd pay 2 cents to read mine, and we'd pay for each other, and if you're a 6-year-old kid, you pay a penny, and if you're a big company, you pay $1,000. And it kind of made it a way that, you know, we could all share and be creative and innovative and not part of a massive system like a template, but be authentic and individual, and this would enable that. And so my question really is there a utopian vision in terms of a humanistic vision of blockchain in which it allows us to be this person who's creative, innovative, and makes enough money to buy dinner, you know, sort of a thing?
So, I don't know, Paul, you said you can't think yourself quite back to 1994 on this one, but...
I mean, I think there definitely is the vision. What's tricky now, so I think Civil has a very positive vision. I feel that there's a lot of very positive visions in this world. What's really tricky now is that the world that Ted Nelson was working from and Doug Engelbart was such, it was so small. They were talking about relatively hundreds of computers, thousands of computers in the world of any significance. And they were seeing very realistically like what the technology would let people do to, and the word over and over was augment, like augment and enhance human technology. And there was an element of empathy there. And it doesn't really align with the way that centralized platforms operate. Like if you look at the work of Alan Kay and you look at the work of that cohort, a lot of their focus was on like, how can we help differently abled people get access to the world? Like it was a real vision that went way, way down, closer to things that we would now refer to as social justice. And that was, they thought that the computer was going to enable that. And it is actually, I mean, it pains me to say, it's just sort of a tragedy of the era that we've lost that ethos, injected just straight up hyper-capitalism instead. And I'm all for a little hyper-capitalism from time to time. It keeps things moving in a way that like an encountered group of technologists doesn't. But at the same time, it would be okay to have a little more of that ethos in there. But I think it's still there. People are still talking about it. There's still a lot of hope. There's indie web movements and people trying to do things and make a more collaborative and open environment. But until there are cracks in the giant platforms, and I think that they're going to, I mean, frankly, just instinctually, I feel that they'll own what happens with blockchain too. Facebook has a head of blockchain, and they have, they'll end up with $1 trillion to operate and make this, make their blockchain central.
So that utopian vision is not, that didn't play out quite. But I mean, actually, this is sort of a point, Salah. When you're kind of selling it in newsrooms, or kind of like what there wasn't. I remember some Matt Isles coming and explaining Civil to me, and I said at the end of it, which is probably what I'd say about it now. I have no idea if this is going to work. I have no idea what the UX would look like. But the idea that you can suddenly create a different marketplace, where actually kind of the same sort of transactions or transactional kind of commerce is different and it has a different quality on it, is really exciting for journalism. What's the kind of what's the sort of the publisher view? Is there a utopian publisher view of this, apart from please let it make us lots of money? It's okay to say no.
I don't think there is one, to be totally frank. I mean, and I actually don't think it's either going to make us a lot of money either. I think that it is probably, I really think of it like a building material. I come from the product and technology side. I think that, we had sticks and leaves, and then we used mud for a while, and then if you bake that mud, they made hard bricks, and we used bricks for a really long time. And then we discovered steel as a building material. And so, I live in Brooklyn, and you see the brownstones now. They're built 120 years ago with all brick. Well, now when people renovate them, they're putting steel into them. And guess what happens? There are no more pillars in the middle of the floors anymore. Windows can now be the size of a whole wall. So it sounds trivial, but literally you don't need as many support beams. You don't need as many things in the way. You don't need a small room off to the side of the entrance because there's a support wall in the middle that can't go away. These things sound trivial, but that's the way I think about blockchain and its application to business and our business, is that, all right, it's not going to let me necessarily do anything I couldn't do before. Even the syndication point I made before, I could do that now. It would be a little bit clunky, but I could do it. But this new material has come out, and we want to use it to do things a little bit more effectively. And maybe down the road, if you kind of appreciate the distinction between an innovation and a disruption, an innovation is loosely doing the same thing a little bit better. A disruption is something that allows you to do new things altogether. For now, blockchain is just an innovation. It's not yet broken into the disruption kind of phase of its life, if it ever does. So for me, it's a better, cheaper building material.
I have to say, I rather like the idea of the Brooklyn brownstone a tiny bit more than the baboon's heart analogy of and also very interesting that a publisher should go to. It's like a brownstone in Brooklyn, but it was very vivid.
I was wondering if we could go back to the point about people with more wealth accumulating more votes. Paul, you had an interesting comment about how founders have more equity within the company, and you have more sway and say. But at the same time, I think founders are held accountable because they could lose all of that equity and they stand more to lose. So I was wondering how you could make it so that there is more accountability for people who have more votes within blockchain, and how do we align the incentives with the interests of the broader group?
That's a good question. Anyone want to take that question?
Can I ask a question back quickly? Sure. Is that I would like us to a little bit explore what we're talking about people being accountable for exactly, because civil law is a constitution, and the votes are about violations of that constitution. And if you haven't read that constitution, it's pretty high level and easy to agree with. So I don't think, and I know this might not be specific to civil, but like in the civil world, even if you have a lot of votes, it's not like you get to just censor people. You know, it's like, I don't like what this person says, I'm going to vote against them. That's not an option. They have to violate a law, a civil law, meaning like news that's not cited or substantially false and known to be so, etc. So, just a little bit of splitting a hair there, but I think it matters when we talk about, somebody having too many votes to enforce the law.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess it was more about trying to reduce like bad actors, and how do we kind of create the incentives to be able to do that?
Well, the hope is that if you're a bad actor, right, and you're putting your votes, you're hedging your bet on the bad side of an issue, and then the larger community who is putting their votes on the good side, when the consensus is reached on the side that the bad actor was not, the bad actor's votes are going to be taken away. You're going to lose certain votes, right? I mean, that's the way also I understand it. It's you're hedging your votes in a way against whatever it is that you're standing for, and if you keep putting if on civil you keep putting votes to shut down newsrooms that are actually operating ethically and that are putting good journalism out there, that you're not going to be able to have that ability to do that because you lose it's going to cost you. It's what was said in the panel before, that I thought it was a great line about it being very cheap being very cheap to say the truth and making it really expensive not to. And I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. Somebody had.
Hey,
right.
how's
Sorry.
it going?
Yes,
Thank you. As a journalist, I can't believe I took the mic to ask a question about advertising, but like throughout this whole day, like we've just seemed to be running into like problem after problem with actually trying to like figure out ways to use blockchain to conduct the act of journalism, and like put it out there, and like there are a lot of interesting questions, but I was wondering if any of you have kind of looked into some of the work that they're doing with like Brave and Basic Attention Token, and kind of benefiting journalism by creating better ad tech and like tokenizing people's attention, which is something they're giving anyway, and you're not like asking them to do something extra.
Right, so that's something as well that sort of Jared Dicker is doing at Poet, I think, as well. But yes, the sort of the Brave idea, which is Brendan Eich's browser level way of returning, again, a little bit clunky, but a way of returning kind of value to publishers. Salah, what's the...
So this is another application, this is another example of something that people are doing in the blockchain that was possible without the blockchain. So in other words, this is, I'm going to allow the user to pay, let's say, 10 cents to view this article. Therefore, the publisher doesn't need to cover it in ads. Coming from Forbes, I can tell you that is very much an appealing option for me. As part of I'm the champion of the user experience there. I do not control our advertising experience, so you can imagine there's a natural rivalry there. And so somebody comes along and says, we can do this, that's amazing. I take that meeting right away. But in the end, you walk away thinking, okay, well, actually, I'm not sure that the blockchains actually unlock this potential. It is, again, maybe a better building material for it. But the appetite for it to be adopted, I don't think is any higher today than it would have been 10 years ago. So I do think it's a bit of a long way to go, because I promise you, even if companies did do it, in a couple of years, if there's a bit of a downturn, they'll start throwing ads on top of it.
Right, I think we have one more. We have time for one more question. It'd be great if it was a woman. Just saying. Or on the other hand, it is 28 minutes past. So I can see Nasheen is advancing the mic. It's fine if you ask a question.
Hey, how's it going? I just wanted to see whether any of you have gotten a sense from people in the blockchain community whether they've shown whether they're conscious of, or whether they've shown any worry about the presence of this other emerging technology called quantum computing, and how I heard that it might threaten blockchain technology because of how fast and efficient it will make computers in the future, and how it might make hacking like the blockchain or just take away some security. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, that's
how it might take some of the security encryption away that the blockchain provides. So just wanted to see if you've heard of, seen any worry from the blockchain community regarding that.
I mean, again, that's a great question, isn't it? Which is, kind of, does quantum just blow through this idea that it's immutable and you can't crack code? And
possibly. I mean, there's just such a big gap right now. It's just not. There's a lot of progress in quantum computing, but it's progress at the, think 1960s level computing. So I don't know when the explosion happens where suddenly that technology becomes real and sort of something you could rent in the cloud. It's going to be a while. There's stuff going on, but it's just not it just doesn't feel like a threat at this moment. Something else will get us first.
And I would say, as that gets stronger, encryption gets stronger, so none of these things are one without the other, just memory and programs, right? So
well, I'd really like to finish on the something else is going to get us first note, which just to keep an upbeat tone. I just want to thank I want to thank the panel. I want to thank you guys who've asked amazing questions. I want to thank everyone who's participated because actually, I feel that we will be back here probably in a year. Probably in 5 years and probably in 10 years, that won't be me, thank God. But discussing this, because it does feel like we're at the start of something and having all of your brains engaged on it has been really fantastic, I think, for us today. So thank you very much indeed and enjoy the rest. Thanks guys, that's great.